important for us, and obviously the DIR is the agency that's tasked with enforcing the prevailing wage statewide. So it's important for all members of the building trades to actually see that there will be more robust enforcement of prevailing wage. It certainly levels the playing field for a lot of our contractors to be able to win bids, because now there's sort of a policing of contractors on public works, so that they're not violating the law and they're not basically unscrupulous contractors that are knowingly falsifying bids in order to win them and basically knocking out those law-abiding contractors. So basically that's what it is, and now we're looking at AB 436 and its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for all your hard work on bringing this to fruition and working with school districts to make this a reality. So I would like to ask the representatives from the Department of Industrial Relations to come on up and make your presentation.
All right, good morning. My name is Mark Wissam. I'm Department of Industrial's Deputy Director for Legislation. I wanted to thank the members of the Implementation Committee for giving DIR the opportunity to talk about our implementation of this program. I wanted to also thank Cesar for all of his work over the last, I don't know how many years it's been now, but working with all the stakeholders in the Attorney General's office to address the concerns that they had with the prior legislation and get us to where we are today. With me I have John Cumming, who's one of our senior counsel at the Department of Industrial Relations and a special assistant to the director, who's been instrumental in working on the legislation as well as our implementation of it, and also Renee Baccini, who's also with the director's office, and will be, I'm sure you'll have a lot of interaction with her as we go forward, and she will be organizing a lot of our public outreach campaign on this program. So with that, let me start out with John Cumming.
I tried to run away, but they made me come back. So I never thought, even when I came to the department almost 11 years ago, that labor compliance programs would become my life work. But they've become my life work. I think I've written 5 sets of regulations on them now. Your agenda materials and Cesar's summary, I think, gives you a good shorthand overview of how we got here today. I'm assuming the committee is familiar with the basic premise of this, and probably had some meetings like this back in 2010 when the program was set to go live. And so I'll start maybe from the basis of, what's changed in terms of talking about the regulations, unless you just want me to go back through and say what the regulations do. Another caveat I always have to give in talking about this, we've projected January 1st, 2012 as the effective date, the go-live date of this program. That's based on the statute, both SBX 2-9, which started this ball rolling, and AB 436, require 2 things to happen. 2 conditions precedent, as we say in legal business, before this program becomes effective. And that's one, that we have approved regulations, and 2, at least for bond-funded projects, which is the concern of this committee, that the fee for the bonds, the fee that DIR intends to charge, has been approved by the director of the Department of Finance. Neither of those conditions has happened yet. Excuse me, as Cesar stated, our regulations were filed with the Office of Administrative Law. We actually got them in a day early on October 28th. The Office of Administrative Law has 30 business days to approve the regulations, approve or not approve. their approval process has to do with whether the regulations meet the conditions for regulations, the statutory conditions, necessity, clarity, reference, there's 6 of them, and whether we've gone through the rulemaking process in the proper fashion. This was a lightning speed regular rulemaking because we had to get it done by October 31st. Or as I like to tell people, at midnight on Halloween, our situation would have turned into a pumpkin because we were on a 1-year timetable from the emergency repeal last year. Having the regulations on file extends that emergency anyway. If everyone is through, please excuse me, we're set to have those regulations effective on January 1st, and we put that hard January 1st date into the regulations as the effective date if they're approved. But we won't know until the middle of early mid-December what Office of Administrative Law is going to do with it. The fee is also in process. My understanding is that those discussions are pretty far along. I'm not involved in that process. Mark is, but the basic concept of the fee you see in the statute, which is Department of Industrial Relations is going to charge for the reasonably and directly related services on a project. That is a significant change in how the fee was originally structured in SBX 2-9 and in the original regulations. The original regulations, it was going to be a flat fee. It was going to be payable up front. It was going to be a one-time deal. And in fact, we temporarily had statutory language that's going to come directly from bond funding agencies to DIR. And I like to remind everybody that 1/4% was about half of what the State Allocation Board, by its regulations, was providing for labor compliance for projects that were subject to AB 1506. So we were expected to do it with half. Now half is the ceiling, and it will be the half of that, I mean that 1/4% or less. The way I think you're interested in knowing how this is going to work, the fee, the Department of Industrial Relations monitoring will only apply to projects under particular statutes. It'll apply to any state bond-funded project, and that would include any bond funding that comes through the State Allocation Board. We don't have to talk about the exception. It's a headache for us. It's not a headache for you. I don't think schools get Prop 84 funding. So we start with the premise that if in any project that gets funding from a state bond, any school construction project that gets school construction bond funding is going to be subject to that. Let's start with the effective date. The effective date is January 1st. Again, that's assuming those other two things happen. That's a hard and fast. That's a hard and fast dividing line, and it's based on when the contract for the construction, the award of the contract for construction, and for the project. The statutory language is a little mushy. It says the award of the contract or the contract for the public works project. Historically, public works was done in one way. The awarding body, the school district, would award a contract with a general contractor to build the school or to do whatever, and then they would have subcontracts with all sorts of specialty subcontractors to do parts of that construction project. But everybody understood, that the prime contract was the contract for construction, the contract that's awarded by the awarding body. More recent times, we understand there is all sorts of permutations of that. There's the multi-prime model where the awarding body is going to have a separate contract with every specialty trade. It creates a little confusion in trying to meld that concept with the concept here of the contract for the public works project. But the way we are looking at it in DIR in terms of what set of rules applies, we're looking for the contract for the project, for the overall project. In other words, we're not going to take something that's underway today in a multi-prime situation, let's say, and because they don't hire the roofing contractor, the electrical work or something after January, we're not going to make them switch over enforcement systems. It's one enforcement system for the life of the project. And so, and again, assuming that we go forward on January 1st, anything awarded, if the school district awards their contract for construction on December 31st, I think that's a Saturday or something, not too many school boards will probably be meeting that day, but if they do, then they're under the old rules for the life of the project. If they awarded it January 1st or later, they're under these rules. The other complication about this, which I think is different than you're used to dealing with, is our requirements don't apply until there's actually the bond funding involved. And so, and the statutory language is clear on that, particularly on, we can only spend the money on projects that are subject to the statutory requirements, and we can only require projects, we can only require awarding bodies to comply with the statute if they have a project that's subject to the statutory requirement. In the case of bond funding, they don't become subject to the statutory requirements until they get the money. And so, unlike, I don't know what may have happened with AB 1506, and they would start a project, and we're going to apply for Prop 47 or 55 money down the line, and they might start out with a labor compliance program. They're not going to be starting out with the compliance monitoring unit. That's what we call our new monitoring unit, or the CMU. They're not going to be starting out with that unless they've engaged DIR, that unit, under some of the alternative sets of rules that don't have to do specifically with bond funding. But so we may be in a situation, since a lot of projects get started before they come to the allocation board for money, we may be picking up people in the middle. We may be picking up people in the end, if it's strictly a reimbursement basis. It's not the most ideal situation, but it's the constraints of the statute and the funding. Whenever they get picked up, they will get looked at, and even if somebody comes in for reimbursement funding, again, we're talking about a project that started after January 1st of 2012, and so we may be talking about a scenario of something that happens a couple of years from now, but if somebody came in for reimbursement funding, they're at least going to get audited by its compliance monitoring unit. Yeah. Now, hopefully, most people will be in the classic situation where they're coming to you for money. Say allocation board may say you coming for money ahead of time, and they know ahead of time that they're going to be subject to this requirement. And so I know one of the first questions is, how do you know and how do we know that a project is subject to the compliance monitoring unit? We have a form for that. We actually have an existing form known as the DAS 13 that every public works project that's for $30,000 or more and that will use a trade or craft that has apprentices in it is supposed to be sending right now to the Division of Apprenticeship Standards. That form, again, it's called the DAS 13. That's been in use for, I think, that law's been in effect, I think, for about 20 years. I can't tell you how consistent awarding bodies have been in using that notification, but that's an existing requirement. A suggestion we got on the outside, which is a great suggestion, is why don't we adapt that form for use so that awarding bodies could also use it to give us notice of projects that would be subject to the compliance monitoring unit, or at least come under this law. And we'll also talk about some exceptions to the law, exceptions to using the compliance monitoring unit, I should say. But so the DAS 13 is adapted, modified into the PWC 100. I emailed that to Brian yesterday, and I hope you all have that. Does everybody have that?
It's also now online as of this morning
Yippee. You don't have the URL, do you?
in my BlackBerry.
Okay. Now, maybe you could look it up.
We can have staff
that around.
make copies for everyone. I have a copy right here.
It's, as a DAS form, it was kind of an obscure place, but I hope we'll get it someplace that's more prominent. And I think part of our public outreach is going to be to make sure that every awarding body in the state knows that they're supposed to be using this form. It really applies to all projects that are 30,000 or more. There are some smaller projects. Probably those aren't the kinds of projects that your body would be funding anyway.
Okay.
You want to say something about that? Yeah.
Yeah, so as of January 1st, though, that form will be online and it'll be submitted electronically. So that's coming. But for now, we have the paper form until that computer project is built.
Yes, we're trying to make this easy. And so the form asks all the questions that we need to know, either to answer the questions that were traditionally asked by the DAS 13 for the Division of Apprenticeship Standards. It'll also ask all the questions that we need to know for the operation of the department's monitoring unit, including the cost of the project, so that we can calculate the maximum fee that the DIR can charge for its compliance monitoring services. Again, I refer to that as a maximum fee. So, and one form, it's only one form, one time, and the form will give the Department of Industrial Relations the information it needs to know to schedule the work and get the work started. Assuming the work's starting right away, then the awarding body is also going to get an acknowledgement. We're still working on what that acknowledgement is going to look like, but certainly ideally, if the project is subject to the compliance monitoring unit, to that law, which we will know from the form, assuming it's filled out accurately. There will be some that are inaccurate, and we'll have to cross-check, and we'll have other sources of information, but assuming it's accurate, we'll have the information. And if it's a project that's subject to compliance monitoring unit, then we'll get an acknowledgement that says, go sign up for the compliance monitoring unit, here's where to go to do that.
Yeah, I can also comment on that. Once the form is submitted electronically, there'll be an electronic message that they'll get stating that there's a possibility it could be subject to the CMU and to go to a link, and that link will take them to the DIR website where they can discern whether or not they are subject to the CMU, and also have contact information so that they can call to be sure. Also, it will give instruction on how to sign up with our contract for the the electronic certified payroll that they are subject to. So what the awarding body needs to do is to follow that link to the electronic certified payroll and register their project. And then after that, what's also going to happen on that form, there's information on the contractor, and the contractor, the prime, will also get a notification that they need to register with the ECPR. They can't register until the awarding body has registered. So there's some electronic pieces in place for that. We will also have staff checking. I understand that there was a concern about how will, is it the OPCS, how they'll know if the awarding body, if the school is complying, if the school district's complying, and we can certainly put a mechanism in place where we can communicate back. So that's definitely in the realm of possibilities, but we do have mechanisms in place to communicate these things back and forth. Additionally, we are coming out with a campaign that will start, an educational campaign that will start in January. We'll have dates of when there'll be some in-person, there'll be a small handful of in-person trainings that will be available for schools to attend, but we will also have webinars as well as recorded webinars on our website. So, thank you.
Anyway, hopefully there will be a mechanism to get people signed up, and then we'll be able to tell. The other thing we're going to be able to tell from the form is if the awarding body believes they're in one of the exceptions to. These are exceptions that are in the statutes. They're subject to the statute. It's Labor Code Section 7071.3 that will cover all bond situations. There are also a dozen other situations, other statutes covering other situations. The overlap that school districts might have is if they do a design-build project under the authorizations in the Education Code for design-build. They also require use of the Compliance Monitoring Unit. There's one design-build statute, I think, for K-12 and another for community colleges. Just to make things complicated and confusing, it does not apply to design-build for CSU. And it probably doesn't apply to UC either, because I think they're a higher form of government than all of us. Just ask them. So anyway, so these statutes, they have exceptions for using Department of Industrial Relations compliance monitoring. One is if there is a previously approved labor compliance program, provided that labor compliance program does not contract with a third party to operate the labor compliance program. And we have a regulation on what that means. That's Section 16455 of the regulations. In terms of what it means, we didn't really change the language from what was adopted in 2010. There are four stated exceptions in there on what does not constitute contracting out for operation, and that's use of volunteers. It's use of people to supplemental work under the supervision of their own staff that they're not exercising judgment or making discretionary decisions. Use of professional staff. A lot of programs, including legacy programs, use outside attorneys. But it does not contemplate hiring third-party programs of people in the private third-party business now to supplement, to do added work, to do any of the work that we would associate with being the work the government does to being the enforcement work. And this is really the way that statute reads. We can't stretch the statute to open the door back for the private third-party contract administrators. Those people can still do the work under projects that are ongoing today that are required to have LCPs for Props 47 and 55, but that's not going to be a feature of the new program. And again, that's in the statute, and we can't change the statute. We're not going to change the statute. I've just gone off on that tangent because it's been a hot topic of interest, something I get a lot of phone calls about. The other exception is a project labor agreement. If there's a project labor agreement for the project in question, and Cesar can probably give you a better description of what a project labor agreement is than I can. The statutory language is a collective bargaining agreement that it covers all the contractors on the projects. And the other qualification is that the collective bargaining agreement has a mechanism for resolving wage disputes. How are we going to monitor that? Well, when somebody turns in the PWC 100 form, there's going to be a box to check. Is there a project labor agreement? And if they check yes, then it's going to say transmit the project labor agreement so we can take a look at it. Ideally, collecting all this information, DIR will be able to build a database, project by project, for the state, and know how prevailing wage enforcement is being done on every project, whether it's being done by the compliance monitoring unit, whether it's being done by a labor compliance program, whether there's a project labor agreement, or whether there's, none of the above. And probably none of the above is still going to encompass about half of public works construction in the state. And the figure I've heard, and I'm not an expert on this, but the bond funding is going to capture, with state bond funding, 40 to 50% of public works. But that would be ideal. I don't know that we need to go into the purposes of prevailing wage, but it's the oldest form of employment regulation in the state of California, and it's to keep a level playing field and for local workers and for contractors and for union contractors. And compliance helps maintain that playing field.
John?
Yes.
Would you mind covering some of the items in your regulations related to notifications and language that's required in school district construction documents and front-end documents based upon the new law, and there's a series of notices that are required. Could you go over those?
Certainly. The notice section, the notices are in section 16451. In section 16451A, that's the PWC 100. That's all there. As again I told you, we took an old apprenticeship form and we redesigned it to give us all the information in here. So if you do the PWC 100, you've complied with A. That's the notification that from the school district to DIR, hey, we've got a project that's going to be subject to the compliance monitoring unit, or also, hey, we've got a project over 30,000 that's going to use apprenticeable crafts. Subsection B is simply says that we can do what we have in fact done, which is to create a form to satisfy both the requirements of this regulation and the requirements of Labor Code Section 1773.3, which is that apprenticeship requirement. C says the call for bids, design build request, if it's one of those, contract or purchase order shall contain appropriate language concerning the requirements of Division 2, et cetera, et cetera. That's about public works prevailing wage requirements. And shall also state that the project is subject to the requirements of this subchapter, meaning these regulations, including the obligation to furnish certified payroll records directly to the Labor Commissioner in accordance with 16461. Now, a couple of complications there. The thing about putting in the call for bids and in the contract documents language of, hey, this is subject to public works requirements, including the requirement to pay prevailing wage, I think that's already in every school district's public works contract and every other awarding body public works contract if they know what they're doing. So this is something currently under the program we've been administering, they're required also to put LCP language in there. Hey, you're going to be monitored by an LCP and you have to do this with the LCP. Our regulations have never gone beyond what this says. We just modified this regulation, modified the old LCP requirement to say if you're under a Department of Industrial Relations monitored project, you have to have this kind of language in there. I did allude to the problem beforehand of what if you don't know that you're going to be subject to the requirement at the time that you're awarding your contract. And my answer is, if you're not subject to it at the time you're awarding the requirement, awarding the contract, you're not required to put CMU language into your documents. However, better practice is to put in there, this project may be subject to this. Haven't drafted any model language. I could do that, but I imagine that there's hundreds of examples out there already of people putting the LCP language in there and just modifying it. And then I think in time when our system's completely set up, we can, give some people, districts, exact language about how to get signed up for the electronic certified payroll. But it's the idea that if the school district is getting into a project and they think they're going to ask for 1D funding or, whatever else comes down the road in future years, that they put in the call for bids and in the contract language, this may be subject to this. When it does, you're going to be required to comply with these things. That's contract language. Item subsection D is a job site notice. And again, this is this is drafted by Tom Fredericks, who some of you probably know used to come to these meetings, retired attorney, Department of Division of Labor Standards Enforcement. But this is a job site notice. This was modified again from the job site notice language that we require for labor compliance programs. And as people know, if you go into any place of employment, probably even all around the Capitol here, that there are various job site notices that are required to be posted so that employees can see, what their rights are to minimum wage, who to call if they, what they're entitled to do if they have a job injury, if they have a discrimination complaint. There's a dozen or more things. This is a specific notice to advise people this project's being monitored by the Compliance Monitoring Unit of the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement. Requires prevailing wage. If you got a problem, this is who you can go contact. It does have a blank line there, local office telephone number, because that's going to be different, obviously, from place to place. But the Labor Commissioner has offices all over the state, and it is intended to be a local office number. And they actually did some mock-up posters. You didn't bring any with you today, did you?
I did not.
No. I know Nancy was showing them around last year, and I think we still have a bunch of them. I'm not sure if there may be some inaccurate addresses on them, since most of our headquarters has moved out of San Francisco. But anyway, that's what that notice is. The way the requirements, the regulatory requirement is written, it obligates the awarding body to make sure that notice gets posted. The awarding body can go do it itself, or they can go tell their general contractor to do it. All the regulations, you'll see, they are obligations of the awarding body, but some of the are obligations like using the electronic payroll reporting, and they tell the contractors, you will do it this way.
Also, we are developing a model for what an awarding body needs to present at a pre-bid conference, so that information will be available. That's in development.
Yeah, that's really outside the regulations, but that's something we're going to do.
Can you cover just a little bit for us how you anticipate billing?
Yes. People will be registered on the system. The project will be registered. I'm not sure, but I think there will be an upfront cost for the registration of the project onto the electronic certified payroll reporting system. That's going to be, that's for the awarding body for the school district. That's going to be basically that system's costing us $35,000 a year, so it's going to be $35,000 divided by the number of projects, which could be in the hundreds or thousands. So it's going to be a very small charge. And thereafter,
Can you repeat that? So you're saying that an upfront cost to register for the awarding body
yes.
of $35,000?
No. That's $35,000 divided by the number of projects in the state.
Just want to make sure.
Yeah. No, they will figure out a flat number by a prediction. There's going to be better statistical minds than mine are at work on this, but we were talking about it yesterday in a meeting with the accounting people, but it's going to end up being a very small number. But that is one of the, that's going to be the total cost of using this figure. Okay, you look incredulous.
Why don't we take comments later? Keep going on the billing part in terms of how you. So there's a registration portion.
Yeah.
So then after that,
they will get billed for actual work performed. Basically, people doing monitoring work. The electronic payroll reporting system will do a lot of the work. It will review every payroll record. And that's not a person doing that. That's just a machine doing it. And the machine will spit out for the staff red flags. Somebody is reporting something that appears to be a violation, or they've reported a set of circumstances that suggest a violation. I'm sure everybody's familiar with tax reporting software. I'm sure a lot of people use it, TurboTax or something like that. And, people now file electronically with the IRS, and the IRS has programs to, tell them we think this is of course the software does all the calculations correctly, so you're not going to have to be submitting something with bad calculations, but the software is going to tell you something doesn't add up here. It's like, we have this, we have a plumbing contractor, and they've classified everybody as a ComTech electrician. Plumbing contractor doesn't do ComTech electrician work, or they're not glaziers. People put in windows. And so it will identify those types of things, and then if the payroll reporting software identifies those kinds of problems, then that will stimulate actual work by actual people, boots on the ground, as we say. There will also be a certain amount of random reviews, audits. Nobody has done anything wrong according to the paperwork, but a certain percentage will be looked at simply to see if the reality matches up with the reporting. And the Labor Commissioner's Office certainly knows through decades of experience with this that there are contractors out there that submit perfect paperwork that might be violating the law, left and right, and may end up getting debarred from doing public works. Under-reporting hours, not putting people at all on their payroll report. That's not something that's going to show up in the payroll report, but that's something that shows up when you go out to the site or when you check with the job superintendent's reports, and they say that this contractor had 10 people working, every day for a week, and their certified payroll says they only had 5. So, but anyway, when there's actual work, then that will generate a bill. It's basically be an hourly rate attached to that person to capture not only the salary, but all the overhead associated with their work. Overhead for work that's specific to the compliance monitoring unit's work and to this project, because we cannot use any of this money to support any activities of DIR that are not for the project that the fee's going to. And then, anyway, so these people will keep track of their time, and the accounting unit will generate a monthly bill that will go to the awarding body. And it will indicate how much work was done. And the accounting unit will have the maximum fee that could be charged at 1/4% of the bond funds. That's 1/4% of the money they get from the state allocation board. That's it. That's the maximum fee. There's no match. There's no anything else in a state bond fund situation. It's 1/4% of the state bond funds. That's the maximum fee. When they hit that maximum, the billing stops. Enforcement doesn't stop. We're in there until everything is okay or something needs to be enforced. Yeah. You want to suggest something, the next place to go?
It sounds like you covered the basics of your presentation. Can I ask you just to hit on one thing? There is a provision in the law that provides some flexibility for school districts related to waiving prevailing wage requirements for small projects. Could you just cover that briefly if they have a labor compliance program that handles all projects?
Well, okay, that's actually been in the law for since the first labor compliance program law was adopted in 1989. It's Labor Code 1771.5, which is the basic definition of what a labor compliance program is. And that statute has always provided that if an awarding body adopts and enforces a labor compliance program meeting all those characteristics, which includes being approved by the Department of Industrial Relations, if it does that for every project that awarding body does, then they have higher exemptions from prevailing wage requirements. The standard requirement that applies to everybody is a contract of $1,000 or more. The higher exemptions for an awarding body that has a labor compliance program for every project, every public works project, not just bond funded, not just this, not just that, it's every, is $25,000 for a construction project, $15,000 for maintenance, and a couple of other things in that. There is a new option, a new wrinkle in SVX 2-9 AB 436 is that a school district or any awarding body can also choose to use the DIR for every project. Again, it has to be every project, pay the fee for every project, and then they can have the IR exemptions. We don't know yet if anybody is going to elect that option. But when we were starting to ramp up last year, we at least had some awarding bodies that said that they wanted to elect that option, and we didn't follow through because the whole thing got suspended. And so we don't know, but that option is there. That's an option in the law. But again, that's a totally in-house program. That's every project. And that's Los Angeles Unified School District. The legacy programs, that's the way they all came in. That's the way, that's the historical model. So Los Angeles Unified School District is that kind of a program. San Diego Unified School District. There may be a couple of other school districts. I think San Francisco Unified is going to try to come under that.
Can you tell us what the department is doing in relation to staffing levels to get ready for the potential load that you have coming?
We do have a plan. It's a stair-stepped plan to ramp up staff. We are already doing in-house training, and everyone's getting on board. There's a plan in place, and I believe we have funding. Is it for 66 positions? In total?
I was going to ask you. So.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 66 positions in total, but we will be ramping them up. As we're aware, the law goes into effect January 1st, but it'll take a while for contracts to get signed, for people to get on board, for projects to get started. So we're working with that.
We're trying to collect the information on projects that are going to be coming online. We've been talking to the staff here of OPSC and have gotten some lists, and we're going to try to translate this into what projects will actually be starting up after the first of the year. We're trying to get to every source we can, and then the bigger project is to try to get. We understand that the Department of Finance collects this data for all bond-funded projects. Somebody at the beginning of this meeting talked about how disjointed and confused school districts can be, and I have to tell you that the school district community is cohesive and coherent and a pleasure to deal with compared to the little special districts and what have you that we're dealing with that are just coming on board with some of the water projects, and instead of having one state allocation board to go through, they've got like 18 different entities that are administering the bond funds. And so we love to work with you because we get things done.
Pleasure of the committee. Are there any specific to DIR questions that anybody on the committee has before we get into OPSC's presentation? Yes, Chris?
Actually, I have just some clarification. I was happy to hear you acknowledge about the multiple prime contracts. Back in August 2010, our county office had 2 projects that fell under the new rules. And when we had our 18 contractors tried to get on the CMU website, we ran into some problems. So I was glad to hear that maybe we won't be facing quite the hurdles that we had last time. So thank you for that. But I was curious about, you mentioned projects that are currently under construction, and I just want to clarify that if we have projects that are currently under construction, yet we award contracts on those projects after January 1st, 2012, those new contracts won't be subject to any CMU fees. They'll just remain under the LCP program that we currently have in place.
If it's the same project.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
You know, there are going to be some scenarios, and Brian presented me with one where that might be a complicated or close call. I think Brian presented me with a scenario where there were really what looked to me like 3 distinct projects. You know, one we're going to fix up this year, and another we're going to fix up this that year, and then but they were bundled together for a funding application. But they're really, as described in this scenario, they've sounded like 3 discrete projects to me. I mean, we just have to follow the language. We don't have any regulatory interest in trying to interpret it one way or the other under the statute. We're going to have plenty to do, and it's going to be a lost leader in terms of the expense of doing it. I mean, we want to do it, and unfortunately, this will just be a temporary problem also.
Dennis?
Yes, you mentioned that if a school district doesn't believe at the time of letting the contract that they are going to be subject to this, that they don't have to include the language and the contract documents, et cetera, and do all the regulations here. But if later on they do decide to go after state money, then they would be subject to an audit by your office at the end of the project or at some point. What will the audit entail, and is it going to go back and say you should have done this, you should have included this information in your contract documents, or what does that audit entail?
I heard a couple of things there. And first of all, when they come in for the funding, then are you talking about strictly a reimbursement basis or somebody coming in the middle?
Well, right now the funding is you can go after modernization money up to quite a few years afterwards for reimbursement, total reimbursement. For new construction, you can file an application anytime up to the occupancy of the building. So if a district did not file an application until shortly before occupancy of the building and going after money or going after funding that way, what would their responsibilities be in the construction documents?
In the construction documents?
Well, for the program in total. Part of that is having wording in the construction documents and following through with a briefing, pre-construction briefing, et cetera, et cetera. But what is your office going to be looking for in an audit in those cases?
Okay, again, so my understanding, there's about 3 different things there. And again, what they put in the documents is whatever's going to apply at the time. In terms of they become subject to the program near the end of the project, what I will tell you is what the Labor Commissioner does right now and the Labor Commissioner has public works enforcement authority and responsibility all over the state. Most of the time it's after the fact. It's based on a complaint. Whether there will be some kind of a more aggressive auditing type of function, as opposed to how they would investigate a complaint right now, that's still being figured out and has to be determined in terms of funding. But what I'll tell you again right now is that let's say you have a totally local project, locally built project is still subject to state prevailing wage, and somebody files a complaint on that. In fact, it's the rule rather than the exception that the complaint comes in after the fact. They come in after the fact. They look at those. They look at the certified payroll records because all public works contractors are required to have them, and they interview workers and what have you. If you're asking, is there going to be an issue about did you have the correct language in your documents, you don't see any enforcement issues on that per se. What you do see after the fact, this has been subject to litigation for years and years, the contractor coming in and saying, the awarding body told me it wasn't subject to public works, and all I can tell people, if it is, even if the awarding body told you otherwise, and there's statutory remedies for that if you get bad information. I hope that wasn't too confusing or complicated.
It's just a clarification. When you're talking about the labor compliance exception, when a district has an LCP, the LCP must cover all their projects, regardless of whether they're coming for reimbursement from the state, to qualify for the waiver.
No, that's for the exemptions. Oh, to qualify for the waiver, yeah, the waiver, forgot about that part, yes. To qualify for the waiver, they have to use the, let me give you the language. They have to use the labor compliance project program either for all projects, which would also carry with it the exemptions, or all projects that otherwise would be subject to this statute, which would not qualify for the exemptions. And so, again, that's the way this thing was written. Last year, I think some of the cities and counties wanted that, but the possibility of having a labor compliance program that covers any project that would otherwise be subject to the DIR fee. That would, but it has to be all of that. It's not I want to do it for this project, but not that project. Sometimes it's referred to as the cherry picking situation. There are obviously going to be, some projects that are easy to monitor and some that are difficult.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions, and then we're going to go right into OPSC's presentation, okay? I'm trying to keep to the original concept here. Okay. Kathy?
Okay, well, I'll have to pick my two.
You can talk.
I only get one. Oh, shoot. Okay.
You can talk to me after.
I really appreciate the effort that it takes to kind of look in the future to see how this is going to work. And I appreciate your comment about how it is easy to work with districts. We also like to do our best to comply with new laws and regulations and old laws and regulations. And I guess if I limit my one, I want to talk about the form a little bit. Right off the bat, I don't see a box on here that says, are you going to apply for state funding? Is this project subject, am I going to get state funding off of this? So
there's a line, and maybe it can be approved, that says, are you subject to one of these statutes? And it'll be in the drop-down list.
Which statute, if any, applies to this project right now? I would put, I don't know. I have no idea.
You don't have there's a drop-down list. I forgot to tell you that. It's not there.
See, that's the difference. That's the difference between this form, which is we only have in place until the 1st, and when we have the computer form, we'll have drop-down lists that state things specifically. Okay. And that will also have more direction. They'll have direction. They'll have you roll over your mouse and have directions for each line as well.
Okay. Having had some, Part B, sorry, having had some practice with another form that we are all very familiar with, and I think most of us have some issues with, I would hope that the DIR would be amenable to fine-tuning this as we go along, because I can pretty much guarantee you it's not going to work from the get-go. There's going to be some little glitch somewhere that, this district doesn't fit into for whatever reason, or this project doesn't fit into. So I would really, it would be unfortunate to have the same problems that districts are encountering on the PIW kind of show up on a new form like this. And I understand it's kind of a refurbished form of an older form, but almost like a beta test kind of thing.
I'm with you.
Okay.
I agree
and then
with
I'll save my rest of my questions for later.
Well, I mean, the whole idea is to make this usable and useful for everybody concerned. If it gives us bad information, or it is going to come with a set of instructions. We've worked on that. But it is to make it useful and usable. If we get bad information, then it's going to fail on that task. We're trying to do, this. I don't know if we can say era of limits anymore. That was 30 years ago. It's something more than that. But, we're all trying to do more with less. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Don't worry, Rob.
I represent Los Angeles Unified, just so you know who is asking you this question. It's really a pretty simple one. You've made a reference to this form, the PWC 100, in your regulations, but you didn't call it out by form name. And I think it will create a little bit of confusion by not having the form name in there. In other words, in the regulation, if you said, here's all the things you have to provide, or you can use this specific form, amongst other things, once that form is in the regulation, then that form is locked down, and you don't have those potentials for confusion. So I just ask you to consider at least incorporating by reference this form into your regulations.
Have T-Boy send me an email. Thank you. No, that's a good idea. We didn't have the form. This was I hope everybody can appreciate this. When we first started drafting these regulations, we thought, let's have an electronic certified payroll system. And then we have it. And let's have this form. And now we have it. Again, the form, actually adapting the form was a suggestion from the outside, from somebody in an LCP, and it was a great suggestion. And what you're saying is great. Probably not a lot of people will read the regulations, but I guess a lot of people do also, and I hope we'll have good instruction sheets on everybody on what to do.
Okay, now we're going to save the best for last. Mr. Pierce?
It won't be the best.
You said there was only two.
Sorry. We got you here, so.
My question, I hope, is simple, but similar to what Dennis was saying, and we as districts never want to make mistakes. We want things to be smooth. But there are situations when after we sign or award the contract and we start the project that we decide to apply for state funding. So I do think we need some more clarification on how we ensure that we don't get ourselves into trouble if that were to happen relative to the CMU. But the fee is different if it's a state bond-funded project or it's not.
The maximum fee is different.
Right. So if we proceed with a project after January 1st, 2012, and we indicate on the form that it's not a state bond-funded project, and somewhere in the course of time we decide that it is there a remedy if we overpay, say, or because it becomes 1/4% of the total project? So, or is it just you've paid what you paid, and if it's over... Do you understand my question? So we come in later and fill out a new form that says we are applying for state funding, but we did ask the CMU to proceed on this project, and we happen to have paid
There is going to need to be a remedy, and that's, it's going to be a particular headache of its own.
for probably both entities.
Yes.
Question for you.
And
for you, can I ask you a question?
Could I just make a comment about the form, too? The form, again, just to remind you, it also fulfills the statute that the DAS requires for apprenticeship. So all awarding bodies who are going to be doing a public works project will be filling out this form anyway. So the form will have been figured out. The answers will be different, I'm sure.
I would hope that most districts who think there's a chance that they might apply for state funding at some time would proceed with the CMU, and it could have happened that they've overpaid.
They're not going to proceed with the CMU unless they're under one of these other statutes. It's either a design build or they've said, we're using the CMU for everything, because
I think, one of these questions is very complicated about what you're talking about. Situations change over the course of the project, penciling it out at the time you apply for approval of the project plans with the Division of State Architect and you undertake the project. I think, this law applies to projects, as you've already noted, that are ultimately funded with state bond funds. And so I think there's a work in progress here about the varieties of situations in which the awarding body, the school district, knew that it was going to be seeking state funds or the bond funds or somewhere down the line. And I think, there's so many permutations of it, it's not helpful for us to give you a definitive answer about what happens in that case. But it's something that is near and dear to DIR's heart, and we'll be working with the Office of Public School Construction and you as well to ensure that we both maintain the spirit of ensuring that the projects that are funded from state bonds, whatever point in time that occurs and is known and doable for everybody, that project, in fact, had the effect of prevailing wage enforcement throughout the lifespan of the project, but also not putting you at too much uncertainty about how much do we pay, how do we implement it, what information do we put in our documents. But it's a very complicated question because of the varieties of situations that arise, and so that's one of our challenges as we go forward to implement this, but we'll be doing that.
We're working with OPSC on notification options, and so when your district is asking for the money, presumably we're going to know about it. So because that means, it means it's on our radar.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Don't leave because we want you to be in the room so we can have the dust up later. But we're going to take, we would like to have OPSC staff start at 11 o'clock sharp. Okay, so we'll take a 5-minute break.
Do you have 10:55? I need to fall back by 3 minutes. The last one we talked about. Oh, it's okay. It's color. I get it, right? Like that. It was special. Okay, so...
Good, now see, you'll come down on the first one. Round 2. Exactly. I've been thinking about that.
It's clear. That's what it's called. That kind of option. Or just construction, period. They don't get, I do all these leases. I don't do them. So, I know where, I know all the intent. So, I don't have, I do have a contract for of sorts. I mean, it is a contract work, but technically my lawyer says it's no longer public. So now what? But we are in a prevailing wage. So for purposes, so I say we are. I'm not going to argue that, but some people might, but I'm not going down that road. I want state funding. I should not be audited or anything for it. I'm not subject to it until I get the funds. That's what I said. And then well, I think they manage it by saying you've got to give that part up. I mean, we just can't keep fighting for trying to get back pay. We've got to say.
Plus your contractors would then have to register all of their back.
Which they could.
They could.
But you need to, the situation for us would be budgeting it, budgeting that CMU fee. Because that's, I've asked my project manager, their budget, just put it in there and we'll use it as contingency. I mean, to me, that's the safe way, and you ask them.
Not everybody would do that.
I know, and you ask them to post it, you just tell the contractors, you may be under this, so get ready, post it in, you might have to place it. What did it post it? It's a poster.
You know, 18 months to years ago, the CMP was trying to get SAP. I think we didn't do this, we didn't know we had to do this.
Well, when you said, well, how do you know when you intend, how do you know when you know you're going to apply? So like already the issue is, oh, you guys aren't going to apply for state funding until later, just to get out. I'm sorry, for the sake of a few $1,000, I'm not going to afford those state funding. I'm sorry, I'm going to apply for my millions of dollars of state funding. That's what they don't do. It's not worth not applying for state funding.
That's a bad economic decision.
Yeah, exactly. So
They could really be facing this if that becomes a bond of districts.
why don't they keep going? Absolutely. They're not subject.
They come in, 6 months
Well, I think they clarified, see, that was the old, all these old questions were like, what are you going to do, what are you going to do? I think it's really clear, it's that funding. That's when it kicks in, that's the trigger, and I think that's great. That's very clear. They compromised with that. They said, okay, we can't go back. We realize we can't go back. This is too much. So to me, it seems like it's all
I think in the overall sense,
But I'm just going to do the, just go over the new construction reg and then say,
Bill, are we taking lunch break at?
modernization.
Explain that definition too. You know, the one and the purpose behind that is to capture the higher bond funds, which is unique to SFP. We don't have to disclose it. Mon saying, and then most of the other regulation changes just refer back to the new construction or mods.
All right, let's get back to work, everybody. That's actually pretty good. We can Can everyone take their seats, please?
Bill, drop the hammer. Come on. It won't work. You should know better.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. And Mr. Smoot reminded me that I was remiss in asking for any audience questions or participation in the previous session, and I just want to remind the audience that the concept here is that we'll have a robust question and answer section after OPSC's presentation while DIR is still here so that we can have interaction from the audience members too. So I apologize if you didn't get a chance to talk first. But I'd like to have the Office of Public School Construction representatives introduce themselves and introduce the proposed regulations.
Thank you. Brian Odell, Office of Public School Construction.
Hannah Konoff, Office of Public School Construction.
I'll be talking about the background and also go through the item, some of the questions, and provide the answers. Please keep in mind that this is still a work in progress. Not everything has been finalized yet, but we definitely want your input as far as where we're at today, and we'll give a little more details as we go through that. For the background, which starts on page 2, DIR went through most of that. So what we end up with is there's a sort of a flow chart, and it looks pretty simple, and it is. It shows the difference between the AB 1506, or the current labor compliance program requirements set in statute, and what they will be after January 1st, 2012. There's a handout for the audience as well. So currently, the way it works is if a project is funded from Proposition 47 or 55, a labor compliance program is a requirement. It can either be performed through a third party or a DIR-approved in-house program. If it's funded from Proposition 1D or maybe even 1A, then there are no requirements. It's exclusive to those two bond programs. After January 1st, 2012, that won't matter anymore. It will be any state bonds, a project funded from state bonds will have these requirements. And so the new statute is Labor Code Section 1771.3, and that there would be an additional SAB grant provided for these costs. We go to page 3, changes to OPSC regulations and forms. We see a very long list of them, and it's because it impacts every SFP program that exists. So we have to go through and either change the regulation to calculate the grant or to have a reference to say that this program, C to E, for example, would be subject to this for any contracts awarded after January 1st, 2012. That would be new to the program. So we had to put those references in all of the different programs. Again, this is a work in progress. Not everything has been finalized. We're still wrestling with some of the issues and how some of these moving parts are going to be implemented. For example, the regulation packages right now are actually inconsistent. It reflects the fact that we're still wrestling with these issues and they haven't been finalized. In one section, you'll see where every project would get the grant, even if it has the exclusions where it has an in-house approved DIR or collective bargaining agreement. Other sections exclude those for the grant. And so sorry about the confusion. It's just a reflection of the fact that we're still trying to finalize all of these. And as soon as we have something finalized, we'll definitely share that. But for today, we're trying to get as much input as possible because of a tight deadline that we're trying to meet to have something as soon as possible. So what projects are not subject to the new LCP provisions? Again, that would be any school district project that doesn't receive state bond funds. And that would also include deferred maintenance or emergency repair programs, because those are general funds. So even though it goes through the state allocation board, the CMU requirements aren't triggered just because it goes through the state allocation board. It's the school facilities program funding stream. That's a difference. Or if a district has a pre-existing DIR-approved internal LCP. So it's our understanding that the internal LCP would already have to be approved currently, that it's not going to be something that districts would be able to apply for in the future. So they already have one. That's one option that districts can pursue. Or if there's a collective bargaining agreement, that the statute also provides that exception. How will the DIR be paid? As Mr. Cumming mentioned from DIR, when the state bond funds are released, the statute then the project then comes under the provisions of that statute, and so that's when again, trying to work this out, but that's when the invoicing and the payments can actually be provided to DIR. How will the process work? Currently, we envision that a school district submits a 54. This is a very simplified version, very clean. There's other more complicated ones that we're still working, but if we think about a scenario where a district submits a 5004, has not started the project, receives an unfunded approval, and then an actual apportionment through the priorities in funding round, that's when it's an actual apportionment, and then the district would go online, register through the CMU process using the different forms that DIR talked about, and then once it has the confirmation page, would submit that along with the 5005 for fund release. So that's how it can be verified that the process has been started, and then a few weeks later the funds actually get released, and then that's when the invoices can start to be paid. So that's a very clean process. Doesn't include some of the other messy things.
Keep going, guys.
How will the fee be calculated? The fee cap is 1/4% of the total bond proceeds. So what we do is through the regulations is determine what the total bond proceeds are going to be, then calculate what that fee cap is, 1/4%, figure out the dollar amount, and then just divide it by the state or the local share, 50-50, 60-40, whatever the program is. So that's what we're trying to accomplish.
Brian, could you read this in your paragraph about how the fee will be calculated? Could you read the last sentence just for me? Starting with therefore, just so everybody can hear that.
Therefore, this cap will be calculated based on the total amount of state bond grants provided for a project, regardless of whether the grant is for site development, site acquisition, financial hardship, or a loan provided to charter school facilities program projects pursuant to the specified regulations.
And career tech.
And career tech. So again, it would be all state funds for the project. So, and this is very different. That's why when Hannah talks about the regulations, we had to come up with a new definition to try to capture that amount, because we don't need to capture it for any of the other grants that are provided. So the financial hardship grant, that apportionment is a state bond proceed. So that has to be added together with the state match to calculate what the cap will be. So Hannah will be walking through some examples, but essentially you take everything that's going to come from the state, regardless of what it's labeled as, 1/4% of that is the DIR cap. Then you figure out the state and local share and then proceed. Now how that works depends on the different program, and so it gets a little tricky, and that's why we have some examples, but that's the concept of what we're trying to accomplish.
Let's, Mr. Dunstan, could we hold the questions until after the presentation?
So actually, that's turn it over to Hannah. We'll go through the new construction regulation, which is sort of the heart of it, as well as the examples and the definition.
Hi,
As Brian mentioned, the first thing that we want to do with the regulations is to add a new definition. The term that we're defining is total projected bond apportionment.
Attachment B.
Oh, yeah, sorry, attachment B, page 11. This total bond apportionment means the total state bond funds to be apportioned for the project, including any financial hardship apportionment pursuant to Section 1859.81, any funds authorized by the authority pursuant to Section 1859.168, and any funds provided pursuant to Section 1859.194, but excluding the DIR cost grant amount provided pursuant to Section 1859.714C or 1859.781C. So basically what that means is we figure out what the grant will be total, add everything that would be coming from the state to the district, whether it's financial hardship loan, any kind of source for that funding. As long as it's a state bond fund, we have to use that as the base to calculate the DIR cap. So in the case of new construction, after determining all other funding provided by these regulations, we start out with Section A, which is still the provisions for Prop 45 and 47. We've changed the wording a little bit so that it will reflect some of the code that was added by SB 436. That language change basically basically the language change is just to sort of reflect that it's a reasonable and directly related cost of the construction. In Section C, we add the portion that includes the funding for AB 436. And what we currently propose is adding, after determining all other funding authorized by these regulations, the board shall increase the grant by 50% of 1/4 of 1% of the total projected bond apportionment for any project for which the construction contract is awarded on or after January 1st, 2012. So what we're doing is we're going to increase the grant by the state share, which is 50% of the total DIR cap. So we add to that pursuant to Labor Code Section 1771.3, any public works project paid for in whole or in part out of public funds that are derived from bonds issued by the state and for which the construction contract is awarded on or after January 1st, 2012, is subject to DIR monitoring and enforcement of compliance with applicable prevailing wage requirements unless the project is exempt from this requirement pursuant to Labor Code Section 1771.3B. And that would be the section that allows the exemption for the pre-existing in-house LCP or for the project labor agreement. Any school district failing to meet the requirements of D1 shall return to the state any state funding for the project, including interest at the rate paid on monies in the pooled money investment account or at the highest rate of interest for the most recent issue of state general obligation bonds as established pursuant to Chapter 4, commencing with Section 16720 of Part 3 of Division 4 of Title 2 of the Government Code, whichever is greater. That's just for protection, so that districts understand that this is critical. It's critical that we comply with that because the new 1771.3 does not provide for any exceptions at all. So of course the modernization language is substantially similar. The only difference is that it's the 60-40 split. On page 36, attachment I, it's second to the last page. We have an example using the funding shell format, but including some calculations that we use of how we expect to be able to calculate the additional grant. As you can see, if you're familiar with funding shells, there's a place where we list all of the different types of grants that will be apportioned for the state portion. And what we're doing is we're changing that state share to a subtotal state share, because now the new state share will include the additional grant. So what we do is we take that subtotal of the state share. In this instance, there is no financial hardship. We would calculate the total projected apportionment from using both of those if there were any financial hardship or other funding. We calculate the DIR cost cap, and then we calculate the state share, which in this case would be 50%. We have to do it this way because we don't want to calculate the state share using, we don't want to spiral. So we have to pull it out as a subtotal in order to make the calculation. The following page is an example that includes financial hardship. And in this case, you can see that in box A, we've had to pull a financial hardship subtotal, because now we also have to subtotal the financial hardship, and added that to the state share subtotal for our total projected bond apportionment. We calculate the cap at 0.25% of that amount. Then we determine that the state share is 50% of that. We add that to the state share, and because this is financial hardship, we also add the district share to the financial hardship apportionment. It would be substantially similar if we were dealing with loan monies.
All right. If we move, and just a quick thought. These are mock-up shells just to show how the math will work. It's not necessarily what the new shells are going to look like. So that's why we put the boxes and all those things around it to make it clear that we will be doing some formatting changes, but not exactly like this. I'll be going through the proposed changes to the forms. So on page 23, it's attachment C. The purpose of this is to try to determine which projects fit into the old or the new rules. So we start off with the 5004, Part 16 in the instructions. We have a C, where if a construction contract was signed prior to January 1st, 2012, check the appropriate box to indicate whether or not the district has initiated and enforced a labor compliance program approved by the Department of Industrial Relations pursuant to the labor code for this project. The purpose of trying to, some of the legacy projects, maybe there's one that starts today, and a district did pursue a third-party LCP, or it has an in-house LCP, it would be subject to the old rules. So the question is, when OPSC processes that application, maybe a year or so in the future, because the unfunded to the final apportionment, which bond funds would it be eligible for? If it started a project today and had no LCP, we would have to exclude 1D as we process it. But if it did have an in-house or a qualifying third party, then it would be eligible for Prop 47 or 55. So depending on the available bond authority when that application gets processed, this allows us to try to line it up with the appropriate bond source at the apportionment, or for the actual apportionment prior to the funds being released, so that we know what it actually qualifies for. And then Part 17, we strike out some of the older language, because At the time, with the current/old rules, it was set up, you can tell, originally, for projects in the future, and now these projects that are subject to the old rules would be past tense. So we're sort of reflecting that change to say if the construction contract for this project was or will be signed on or after January 1st, 2012, check the appropriate box to indicate which of the following methods will be used to meet the requirement for prevailing wage monitoring and enforcement. And so instead of bullets, we would have a box where the district could let us know how the compliance will be, and that will help OPSC process that at the 5005 stage to ask for the appropriate documentation, not asking for one type of documentation when the district is actually going to be submitting a different type. And then on the next page, Part 16, project progress dates. We still ask for the construction contract, the notice to proceed, but now we say if the construction contract was signed prior to January 1st, have you initiated and enforced a labor compliance program approved by the DIR pursuant to that labor code section? Again, so that they would know, so that we would be able to determine which bond source would be appropriate to fund that project. We capture that information as soon as possible. Part 17, if the construction contract was or will be signed on or after January 1st, 2012, please indicate which method will be used. And again, they would just check the box.
Just since we're on it, and I'll forget, everything in your regs says signed, but everything on the DIR side says awarded, and those are two very different activities. I think it's awarded, but I just wanted to, I would have forgotten that.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. We can make that change. Mm-hmm. And then page 9, I'm sorry, 23, which appears on page 9 of the 5004, we just have a certification that the district will or has contracted with the DIR for prevailing wage monitoring and enforcement pursuant to the labor code section. If the construction contract is awarded on or after January 1st, 2012, and the district has not obtained a waiver for the requirement pursuant to that labor code section, the district understands that if it fails to meet this requirement, it will be required to repay all state bond funds received, including interest and, whoops.
The "and" is just part of the language.
Oh.
It's not the end of the section.
Sorry. It just continues on. We don't have any more changes to the rest of the section. It was very long, so we just sort of abbreviated it. But those would be the changes that we would insert. The purpose of that is to make it clear that the project isn't eligible for state bond funds if this process isn't initiated. So we want to make that clear so that when we process the 5005, the hope is the process has already been started and we just release the funds. So to try to let everyone know that there's no options, we don't have flexibility. All right. And that's pretty much it. Everything else sort of reflects those basic concepts.
What about H?
Oh, yeah.
5005.
Yes, thank you. The 5005. Attachment H on page 34. In general information, number 3, for projects for which construction contracts were signed prior to January 1st, 2012 that require a labor compliance program pursuant to Labor Code Section 1771.7. So again, we're specifying that these would be the requirements that a district would have to submit, documentation of a third party or an in-house, only if the project was signed prior to January 1st, 2012. It refers back to the Labor Code section because that specifies Prop 47 or 55. So we're going to know that if it's 1D funding, we would know the appropriate questions and documentation to process. For all projects for which construction contracts are signed on or after January 1st, 2012, we would require, along with 5005, acknowledgement from the Department of Industrial Relations, receipt of the district's notice. However, if the construction contract was signed less than 60 days prior to submittal of this form, we will accept a copy of the notice to DIR form from the district in lieu of the DIR acknowledgement, or all school district Department of Industrial Relations approval letters for the district's in-house LCP, along with the extensions. So the purpose of, and again, this is a work in progress, and we'll have to see how that plays out with the online submittal form that DIR was talking about. But the idea, the concept here was, if districts are able to start with the CMU right away, regardless of when they get the bond funds, and they've already completed the entire process by the time the funds are going to be released, we would ask for just documentation of that. But if they just signed or just awarded the construction contract, they don't have all of that documentation. So in that case, we would ask for something that shows that the process has been started. An acknowledgement letter, perhaps the printout of the receipt number that comes up that DIR was talking about, something like that. We're still trying to work out exactly what form would be used. And then the certification, just the same as on the 5004, that it has to comply with the CMU requirements, and that if it doesn't for the project, then the state funds would have to be returned plus interest. Hopefully, we capture all these things before, so this doesn't happen, but that's just a reminder, again, that we don't have flexibility. And then also, just sort of clean up a little bit on the 5005, we would just have a place for people to put the name of the person signing and some of the contact info, make it easier for staff to follow up with any questions. Sometimes it's hard.
I just wanted to emphasize once again that this is a draft proposal. We are, and it is subject to change. We're very interested in receiving input from the committee, from the public, that is going to help us finalize the proposal. So, again, we welcome the input. Okay, so we'll entertain questions or comments from people on the committee first. Okay, so Chris, yours.
Yeah, another clarification here for me. On page 4, down towards the bottom where it says, how will the fee be calculated, it includes site acquisition costs in your statement. But if I look on DIR's proposed amendments to the regulations, on page 9 it says item G, estimated total project costs, then it has some more language. It says, but not including amounts paid for land acquisition or for internal costs or contracts that are not for public works.
It's our understanding that that's talking about a situation where a district is voluntarily initiating the CMU and not receiving state funds. There is another section, though, that talks about if the district is going to receive state funds, then it's just 0.25% of the total bond proceeds.
But I think the program is going after, it always references back to 1720, which defines public works, and site acquisition costs are not included in that definition.
Why don't we have DIR come up, if you wouldn't mind? Can you guys come back up front, John, Mark, Renee, so you can participate in the discussion? If I can add to that too. Right now, the proposal is basically we're trying to calculate the maximum amount of the fee, which would be the total state bond funds, which in some cases may include site acquisition. So there is a maximum that's calculated. From this maximum, it's to understand that DIR would then draw down the reasonable and appropriate cost that they're going to need to monitor the compliance. So right now, it's a calculation. How much is going to be calculated
up front, and then that's the ceiling. And then from that, there could be potentially the drawdown of what the actual cost would be.
Let me comment on this, and I knew this question was coming. That's a good description, Warren. I call everybody's attention to the, I think you got the regulations, 16452. Page 13 of the regulations. I'm sorry. Yeah, we're all doing regulations here today. Department of Industrial Relations regulations. Section 16452. We have the two formulas, and these are the two, and Juan described it very well. These are the two few maximums. The actual charges are for actual work as it's incurred for prevailing wage monitoring and enforcement on that project. But there's two maximums. The maximum for bond-funded projects, state bond-funded projects, is 1/4% of the state bond proceeds. The other maximum is the total project cost formula maximum that we've, and again, these differences are in the statute, but that we came up with this formula that's for all the non-bond funded. But I also want to call your attention to that total project cost formula in Steve is also a hard cap, and that also would apply to the bond. And so even though in a case where site acquisition is part of the state bond grant, so that site acquisition cost goes into the calculation of the maximum fee that might be payable from state bond proceeds, it's still going to be the lesser of what you get either from 1/4 of 1% of bond proceeds or 1/4 of total project costs, which is a definition which excludes site acquisition and a couple of other things. Yes, it's very complicated. It's one of the complications that was introduced with this, what we've been through in the last year. But that limitation is there. And again, the fee is only for actual work.
I mean, I think as far as I can tell, the question really is, are the total state bond proceeds to calculate the cap to be inclusive of site acquisition? Is that your question, basically? Yeah, and I think the current interpretation of in the regulations that OPSC is presenting is that it is. The statute says that the amount charged by the department shall not exceed 1/4% of the state bond proceeds used for the public works project.
I agree. Yeah.
But there's a second cap.
Well, I'm not. I know that. That's okay. Okay. Good. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I understand there's a second cap, which is total project costs. So how do you get there?
That's if it's not state funded.
If it's not state funded, or is it if? Well, I want to hear from them.
Yeah, maybe we should.
From you.
So, no, the not state bond funded, there's a dozen statutes that require use of this compliance monitoring unit that are not based on receiving state bond funds. Mostly design build projects. Some very specific things like job order contracts by LAUSD, model redevelopment projects in San Diego, Sonoma Valley Hospital. We get some pretty particular statutes that that currently have LCP requirements, and they're going over the requirement to use DIR. And then there's also a situation if a school district or a learning body wants to use DIR for all their projects, then the total project cost formula and that total project cost cap is in the statute.
Well, I'm concerned about that because it's in conflict with this. What's in the statute? It's in your regulation 16452C, but that is not consistent with what's in the law. I mean, because when we use total project costs, that has a meaning. When we use total state bond proceeds, that has a completely different meaning. Anyway.
Well, I've spent a lot of time trying to persuade people from Cash and other places of that, too. But I think we are authorized by regulation to come up with a cap on what we're going to charge that's lower than what the statute authorizes. The statute sets the ceilings, and we're saying we're not going to go over, we're not going to go over 1/4 of 1% of bond proceeds. And I agree with you, bond proceeds make bond proceeds. But we're also saying in any event, it's not going to be, what DIR is going to charge is not going to be more than 1/4 of, it's not going to be, it's going to be the lower of these two figures. I think it's going to be the ceiling.
That I would have is that, as someone who ran projects, most of the modernization projects that our district did, the total project cost was far in excess of the state bond proceeds.
Exactly.
So that your calculation would be way higher if it was calculated on total project costs than it would be if it was calculated on state bond.
No, I'm saying if in those rare instances where the bond proceeds pay for site acquisition and it yields a higher number, you're still going to get the benefit of the lower number as the ceiling. That's what I'm saying. That's the way the regulations are written.
Okay. So Lee had the first question afterwards. Sorry.
Thank you, Bill. I think this is another calculation thing. And so if the calculation is based on the site acquisition as well, I'm going with the total bond proceeds, let's just stick with that cap for now. I'm wondering what the bill is going to look like. Are we going to be able to look at the hours worked, like any other vendor bill that we get, and the itemization of the hours that were spent, and how that fee is calculated? Because I heard you say, thank you, okay, there we go. And just the talking about reasonably and directly related costs, is anybody going to be monitoring what the bills look like overall for all the, as the projects go through with this program, with the CMU?
Not sure I understand your...
Well, is it, you've said that it's, well, the cap is 1/4 of 1%.
That's when the bills stop.
That's when the bills stop, and you have made a statement that that's low because you're expected to do same thing with half. You made a statement sort of with half the fees, we're going to be expected to do the same thing. So my assumption is from that, you're probably thinking it's going to be at the 1/4 of 1%. It's every time you're going to hit it.
Most of the time.
Okay. So even if it includes site acquisition, which there would be no reasonably indirect costs, directly related costs associated with that, but your actual hours, you estimate, based on what you've done before, that it's going to be over that. You're going to need all that money.
I would estimate that, off my top of my head, to guess. I don't do the work in the field. For comparisons purposes, I did a little sketch ad here while I was sitting in the audience. On your regulations, attachment B, I just want to show you some number comparisons. Page 11. This is the OPSC item, so page 11. So you look at those numbers down at the bottom. This is your LCP grant.
Under 4755.
Yeah. And so let's take, so we have $16,000 for the first million, 1.6% of the next $1 million. So you got a $2 million project. So your LCP grant is $32,000 under that. What DIR gets for that is $5,000. So next figure, LCP grant is $37,000.
You're saying that under the new program with the 1/4 1% cap,
the max
would be
$5,000
as opposed to
$32,000.
Are we submitting the state grant?
I'm talking to you about when I said this is less money, and go down there to the item where it says 44% of the next $5 million or any part thereof. At that point, you're up to an $18 million project. LCP grant is $102,100. Maximum DIR fee, I think, is $45,000. So, maximum.
Thank you. Hold on just a sec. Lyle, you had your hand up earlier. Do you have a question, or it's been answered? Or a comment?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand how this fee is done yet, and I'm going to have to go back and do a lot of reading to see how the cap is this calculated on all funds, and the fee is calculated on the contracts. But anyway, I have a question about the 5005, because the 5005 requires documentation from DIR, but DIR's regs say you make your application either when the awarding body makes the award or when the funds have been released. So whichever is later. So their regs say you don't have to make your application until the funds are released, but your regs say you have to have their documentation with the fund release. How does that work?
That's a great question. We're still trying to work it out. We would think, though, that when the district is ready to submit the 5005, they know that they're going to get the funds potentially in just a matter of weeks. So there could be a situation where a district just goes online and, registers, because I believe they can earlier. It's just that the requirement doesn't actually kick in. So they could come in earlier knowing that the funds will be put into their account in just a matter of weeks in anticipation of that. That's one possibility.
I understand that you could do that. Excuse me, Bill. I understand that you could do that, but why not fix the regulations so that issue won't come up? Just change the DIR regulations, say you have to submit your request before you can ask for a fund release, from the state allocation board. I mean, that really...
Again, this is one of the areas that we're still trying to finalize, and we're working with DIR to see what the appropriate notification would be for OPSC for us to be able to release the funds.
I'll acknowledge our regulatory language right in that particular area is not the greatest, and it's been a moving target, and part of the problem is getting the regulatory requirement to match the statute, to match the reality of what people have to deal with. What SAB decides to require is what SAB decides to require, of course, and we're going to try to do everything on an informal basis, but if everybody says it's a work in progress, and if we can fix it up later, we can. It's not easy, but doable.
Okay, Fred, you had a question?
Can you clarify what the site acquisition the site acquisition entails? Is it just the cost of the property, or is it 4%, the DTSC, the mitigations, lawyers?
All of that. So if you look at the example on the funding shell, any of them, after all other project costs have been calculated, including site acquisition, everything, and what currently would be the state share, you take that amount, 1/4% of that, so it's everything.
Okay.
Would be the cap. So all of the site acquisition costs.
So our state colleagues at DTSC will work for prevailing wage, I assume.
That's just for calculation purposes. It doesn't mean that everyone...
Again, this is just to calculate the maximum amount.
Right, which could be a huge amount.
It could.
Right.
It's going to be a 1/4%.
And a changing amount as additional cleanup costs may happen, as we saw recently at the board.
Okay, so that's a good point. So there's adjustments later to the total bond proceeds. How do we handle that?
That's a good question.
Okay.
Something we'll have to consider.
And then sort of related on that, so for CTE, is this a money above the $3 million, or does that statutory limit of $3 million apply and the DIR stuff is subtracted from that, or would you get $3,775,000?
Again, right now, the calculation is going to be based on the total amount that they receive from the state bonds. And it's going to be 1/4%. So whatever they get for DTSC, whatever they get for all the grants, and again, this is different for us.
The question was, does the CTE amount for the $3 million cap,
Has a grant limit.
does that go up, or is the fee taken out of the $3 million cap, and the cap is still $3 million, but now you have additional
No, I
costs?
see what you're saying.
Yeah.
the way the regs are written right now,
I think that's only one where there's a
the cap would still apply, and it wouldn't be above that.
Yeah.
And that was because of, work in progress, just because of, it's a statutory cap, and we don't have an exception for that.
Okay.
Okay, I got Dennis first.
I guess I'd just like to express a concern, and the concern is with the, and I was looking for it here, but with the paragraph in the regulations, I don't know where it's at, that says that basically if you don't comply with the process, that all funds for the project can be withdrawn. And I see a lot of uncertainty out there, particularly with the DIR part of this process, and particularly with a case where a district may start the construction project and then later on decide to submit for funding, and what it is with DIR that is going to say, or what you're going to use as criteria for saying that a school district didn't follow the process. I mean, if they basically complete the entire project prior to submitting for, as they could with a modernization project, complete the entire project without submitting to OPSC, and then come in and submit after the project is completed. If I'm understanding what you're saying is nothing would have to be done because they didn't receive any bond funds during the project, therefore nothing would have to be done. Is there going to be any problems with on the funding side, saying that there is a requirement for labor compliance, but nothing was done?
I want to address that a little bit. And I think, we may have inartfully spoken, tried to generally address these specific reimbursable situations where DIR doesn't have all of the answers to that yet. What happens in the event that a school district which intended to use state bonds to support this project, but at the time it started and completed the project, even if that was contract entered after January 1, 2012, what happens if the first notice to anybody that it was, in terms of state allocation of bonds, occurred after the project was completed? I think we have to look very carefully at that situation and determine whether or not, in implementing the requirement of the legislation that any project which is supported by state bond funds, at what point in time it makes the best sense to say, well, the school district, the law required you to contract these services of DIR or use one of the other options available if it's eligible to go to OPSC to receive the state allocation of bond funds. So I think, this is something, and I understand your concern.
But you may not know that until after the contract is either awarded, or it could be completely done before you know that you're going to be using state bond funds.
Why? Why wouldn't you know that?
Because with modernization projects, you can the project can be complete and you can apply for reimbursement. Therefore, you may go through the project using your own money and then say, well, we probably should apply for a reimbursement for this. Therefore, my application comes after the project is done.
Can I even, I want to add on that,
Okay.
so you understand. And I was talking to someone out in the lobby. It could be new construction. What I was explaining, I can start a new elementary school that the board says we have to build this school, and I'm sorry, DIR has to hear the fun parts of OPSC here, and we may not have eligibility. We may have had a dip in kindergarten enrollment or something, and our eligibility may have dropped. Before we've occupied that school, the following October, we may have had a spike in kindergarten enrollment, and now we're all of a sudden eligible for a school that we weren't when we awarded the contract. And so we haven't occupied it yet. I can submit a 5004 to Brian. We're eligible, we get the funding, and we didn't even know that when we award it. And that doesn't happen all the time, but it happens frequently. Or districts, I hate to admit this, may not even know they were eligible for a project, and they wake up one morning and go, oh my gosh, it's 3 in the morning, and I should have applied for state funding, and I didn't, and I'm going to, and I can. So those are the situations that reg section says give all the money back.
You could be 99% done with a new construction project before you make application, as long as you haven't occupied the facility. So, and what happens in those cases?
And I don't think there's any intent to diminish the complications and the varieties of situations which can occur here, but I think DIR is starting from the standing point of implementing the law, which is that if we want to use state bond funds to support this piece of construction, the state has made a policy determination that it has to have this active prevailing wage enforcement mechanism during the life of the project. And so, any of the million of requirements that entities have to comply with in order to be eligible to receive state bond grants, this is one of those requirements. But I think there's an interest in DIR and OPSC working together with the stakeholders to make this a sensible implementation of this very complicated situation when you're coming for state bonds after this project is all or largely complete.
So what I'm hearing you say is that school districts are conservative people, in order to be completely safe, regardless of whether you're going for state bond funds or not, you should go through this process. That's just to be safe.
If you want to be eligible for state bond funds, the law states that you have to have had this service.
Well, and Dennis, I think just to piggyback on what, as a best practice for school districts to be safe, as you say, to comply with the law, they could contract with DIR, CMU. They could have an in-house LCP that's approved, which many districts have already, or they could have a project labor agreement, and they would meet all of those requirements and then could come back at a later time, anytime, apply for funding and be safe.
It's not my question, but it's...
Well, I've got other people ahead of you, but...
But it's relevant to this whole point that we're making, because I heard earlier when I said I would be safe, and if I thought there was a chance, I would go through the CMU process on a project. But I heard an answer that said, no, you can't do that. All of your projects, you have to agree up front that all of our projects would go through the CMU process.
So let's clarify that.
All projects that would be subject to the CMU process, in other words, that would come under the bond funding or the design build for school districts.
DIR sent a memo out last month that said projects where you're receiving state funding, you must go through the CMU, and the cap is 1/4% of state bond proceeds if you do that. If you elect for all of your projects that go through CMU, your cap is 1/4% of all project costs, excluding land acquisition. So can I just decide which projects, whether or not they're getting state funding, go through CMU, or all my projects must?
We are mixing concepts here.
They're not. They're all very much tied to each other.
No, but I'm saying that there's...
What I would do is if I'm risking a project's state funding that I may or may not ask for state funding on, I don't know what everyone else would do, would go ahead and go through the CMU process.
Okay.
However, if your regs mandate that, no, you can't selectively choose if it's not getting state funding, you can't selectively choose which projects, rather all of your projects must go through the CMU process.
I think and I'm not sure if this is a different way of thinking about the language, but when we're talking about all projects, you're using the CMU for all projects, that all projects, the way DR thinks about that, that's qualified by all projects which have a statutory obligation in that background to use either a CMU or LCP. So it's not, if you're doing things which wouldn't otherwise be subject to the law itself, you have something which is a public works project, but it's not either one of those categories of design, build, state bond funds, that all public works projects doesn't relate to that category of public works things.
Kathy?
Well, I think that just confused me more. So I have many projects that I do not have eligibility for. So I'm not required right now to do this, the CMU process. Can I still do a third-party LCP to make sure that I'm complying with prevailing wage?
On your own nickel, sure.
On my own dime?
Sure.
Okay.
Always.
So then, getting back to this all-or-nothing thing, so I have 3 projects, let's say, that do qualify for MOD. Could I sign up those 3 individually under the CMU programs? That's kind of one question. And the second question would be if it is all or none, and I have to do all my projects, some are state, some aren't, what was the cap on my non-state funded projects? What would the DIR charge me for my CMU program on my non-state funded projects?
That's the total project cost formula, and that's what's calculated. What that excludes, it's a total, take the total cost of the project, excluding land acquisition and other parts of the project that would not, essentially would not be subject to prevailing wage.
And
Like
1/4 of 1%?
At 1/4 of 1%, yeah.
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 So I think we really do need to clarify that all or nothing thing. Thank you.
Cesar? You had a question earlier?
Just a comment, we went through about a year and a half of working with the Attorney General's office on trying to get this all, well said, put into statute to actually apply. There's just a concern that having these regulations move forward now without having them involved could possibly lead to some problems with the AG's office and bond sales. Curious, has the Office of Public OPSC spoken with AG's office or bond counsel and kind of vetted these regulations through them?
No, not at this point we haven't. Again, this is just a preliminary draft, but we haven't talked to them yet.
Considering the time frame, it's probably very important that you reach out and you get them on board to see if there's any changes that they would require. It's just, I think, based on previous experience with what we went through earlier.
Good comment. Thank you. Dennis?
I'd like to piggyback on what Kathy was saying. If a district does not anticipate going to the state for funding on a project or a series of projects and elects to do the non-bond funded formula of project costs, this has two parts to it. First of all, how do you determine what the total project cost is? And secondly, if the district then, if a district starts out with that process and then switches midstream to submit for funding at OPSC, how do you figure out what the fees are, and if you've gone over the maximum for the state bond-funded programs, is DIR going to reimburse the district for that difference?
The first question is, how do you determine the total project cost? And that's going to start with an estimate from the awarding body, from the district, which is presumably going to be, that's one of the line items on the PWC 100, and that's presumably going to be based on information in the contract documents. If there's a need to go out and and fine tune that, we're going to have to do that, recognizing that an error of $50,000 is going to have only a microscopic effect on the ceiling of this fee.
You don't understand. Total project costs, construction costs on a new construction project are typically about 75% of the total project cost. 25% is the soft costs that are involved. That's all the fees, DSA fees, and it's not $50,000. You may be talking about several $1 million in soft costs.
No, but you're basically telling me that the school district, when they put in their estimate on the PWC 100, is going to be able to do that calculation. They'll know what the total project cost is, subtracting out those soft costs.
Yeah, I thought I heard Mr. Cummings say that the total project cost would be based on any costs that are subject to prevailing wage.
Yeah.
If that helps you.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So then the second question was, and then actually, I'm glad to hear something coming back from earlier this morning, and is there going to need to be some kind of refund mechanism if it turns out that you've exceeded the bond formula ceiling? Then yes, and the answer is yes. That may, we just need to figure that out.
I'll take a couple more questions from up here and then open it up to the audience. Kathy?
Is it reasonable to assume that if I decide today that my next mod project, for whatever reason I don't have my eligibility done or something, I'm going to do my own in-house or third-party LCP program, and when I'm done a year and a half from now, I decide I'm going to apply for state funds because I'm now eligible? Would my process that I put in place at the time of my awarded bid comply or be acceptable to DIR/OPSC in terms of, did I meet the requirements of this new law? So I had an LCP in place, I didn't think I was going to go for state funding, and now after I'm done, or close to being done, or within my legal parameters, I've decided to apply for state funding. If I can show that I've complied with the law a different way, in other words, not through the CMU but through an LCP, is that going to be acceptable as proof that I've met the intent of the law?
So assuming you entered into that contract on or after January?
After January,
The first part of the premise had contracting potentially with a third-party LCP, which under the statute does not allow for a fee waive or an exemption from the DIR service if you've contracted out your responsibilities to enforce prevailing wage law, reviewing certified payroll records with a third party. Now, if you've implemented that yourself and you have an approved program, you are potentially eligible for that exemption from the DIR CMU service.
So it's kind of boiling down to we better just play ball with the CMU if I ever want to come in for state funding. I mean, that's really what it boils down to.
Or have an in-house DIR-approved LCP, or have a project labor agreement.
Well, I mean, it's too late for an in-house
Okay.
PLA.
I'm just saying, do you have three options, it sounds like to me.
I do have a question about data dumps and stuff. Can we talk a little bit about, I don't know if you guys have talked or thought about, as contractors are providing you the information, the data, is the software that you're using or the process that you're using, has it been discussed about being able to, okay. Because that's going to be huge, because that could increase our cost.
Actually, the last improvement, as I understand, to the PwC 100 is that they're going to be able to do a data dump on that. Is that right, Renee?
Yes.
That's the last part of it, yeah.
Right. So as far as the contracts coming in, that
just their prevailing wage documentation that comes from a
right for the ECPR. Mm-hmm. Right. So how that's going to work is the awarding body signs up with this. The company that we're contracting with is called Hill International. Hill International, and you will be able to get a direct link to that from our website. And that website, our website is, we plan on putting up information in early December, as soon as we've revised all the language. So the awarding body gets signed up with Hill, and after that they're responsible for telling their contractors to sign up, and the contractors are responsible for telling their subs to sign up. And so so once the awarding body has put the project in the system, the general comes along and signs in, and so on. The awarding body will have will be able to view all of the ECPR, all of the records. They'll be able to see the contractors and the subs. Now, the general will be able to see the subs. The subs won't be able to see the generals, but they'll be, if they hire any subs, third line, they'll be able to view those subs. So it's kind of like everyone's able to look down. So that's how the awarding body is going to be able to see whether their contractors are paying the correct prevailing wage. There are real simple markers. There's, like a red flag. There's different markers that say different things. There's a marker that will say it's questionable, and you just kind of push, and you click on it, and it has a little explanation of what the question is. There's red flags because the prevailing wage is, the determination is going to be, for the project is going to be, put into the program, so it'll be able to see if it's matching. We're also looking at putting the determination on the project itself, so that when the contractor comes in, they'll know which determination to go by. So we'll have that available as well. Is that helpful?
Rob, did you have a question?
Just clarification again, I apologize. It was mentioned, the formula, Brian, on the bottom of your page 11, that is not the formula that you use to generate the grant amount for a project under CMU or a project awarded after January 1, 2012. That's the formula used prior to.
correct.
You're only going to give us, if it's not financial hardship, half of the 1/4 of 1%.
That's correct.
So we're not, we're not making any money on this. In fact, we're going to have to pay as a district match. So I don't want people leaving the room thinking that formula on page 11 is what will generate the money we get to pay the fee. It's not.
Right. The formula on page 11 is for the state share of the third party.
The old program.
Yes, and so that's the state share.
Oh, and the district matched that also.
Exactly.
Right, so this is...
We heard a formula. I just wanted to be clear on that. Thank you.
Chris had a question. Sorry, I got a line.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I'm looking at, and I'm sorry I can't do math very quick here, but I'm looking on page 37, and this is for OPSC, and it's kind of financial hardship specific. Under new construction financial hardship, it shows a cash contribution of $72,103. Now, if that's savings from a prior financial hardship project, and that's bond fund savings, is that rolled in to calculate the DIR fee? Because that would be subject to the fee.
Under the financial hardship program, there are no savings that are eligible. The savings automatically gets returned back to the state. So the $72,103 would have to be just local funds.
He's asking whether it's used to calculate the cap. That's what I
know. But if we use savings towards another project, towards our next project.
If it's non-financial hardship, you mean? Because if it's financial hardship, then the savings automatically gets returned back to the state, unless
we apply it to the next financial hardship project. No.
Yes.
I hear yeses and no.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat your question, please?
Okay, so if we have, like, I got a project under construction right now, 100% state financed. So if my savings, if I don't spend $72,103 of that project, and then I apply that towards my next financial hardship project, and my apportionment is reduced by that amount, is the DIR fee, is that $72,000 still included in what's eligible for that DIR CMU fee? Because it should be, because in essence that's $72,000 in bond savings. Am I explaining it? No, because you haven't, because if they're only billing you on the actual project cost, they shouldn't bill on the $72,000 that I've saved.
And right now it's
so it should still be subject to.
Well, I wouldn't use words like total project cost in relation to OPSC's fee calculation. That's a DIR term.
Correct.
So total bond, state bond funds is what we want to use here.
No, but the question was whether I was being billed twice.
I know, I got it. So it sounds like we need to follow up and...
We'll have to take a look at it.
Yeah.
I have a feeling it's all going to kind of come out in the wash. Part of it will depend on some of... Let me finish. Will depend on some of that truing up with the reimbursement and paying back. But if that $72,000 is entirely state bond funds, then there was a grant, 1/4% that was calculated for the other. So we'll have to look at it and make sure that it works out. But I think we're going to be okay. But that's a very good question. Thank you.
And one thing to bear in mind again is the DIR. These formulas for these caps that we're talking about, and it's complicated, obviously. It's DIR, we're billing essentially on an hourly rate for these actual services performed project-specific, and you're getting that invoice on a monthly basis. We don't get to keep money if the entire amount of what was calculated as the total percentage of bond funds available to spend on this DIR service, you're not getting billed ever twice by DIR for anything.
Right. We literally have timesheets where you do the work and you write it in. So it's exactly for the work that we're doing.
Okay, Chris Ferguson from Finance.
Sure, I have more of a comment than a question. I just want to thank DIR staff, OPSC staff for all the hard work you've done in relation to implementing AB 436 and SB 2X9. It's much appreciated. And I will be working with your staff. I have contacted them to get them the information on all state-funded projects. There's some other workload in another unit. The other unit houses that information. So once I get that, I will be forwarding it to you promptly.
Thank you. Did you have a final question? Then we're going to open it up to the floor.
Yeah, and actually something we haven't talked about yet. So the project's moving along, and all of a sudden a bunch of red flags pop up, and what I'm concerned about the progression of my project, and who now gets to potentially stop my project if anybody delays because, while we're clearing this thing up, and maybe it was a data input error. So has there been any conversations about what happens when the red flags go off, and I'm, 15 days away from opening school kind of thing? So
the enforcement mechanisms are the enforcement mechanisms that have always been there. And the labor commissioner, who is ultimately the labor enforcer in the state of California, they can't shut down projects. They can stop contract payments to contractors, and that's the kind of the main enforcement mechanism in the public works laws and the labor code. We've tried to tailor that authority. You have a couple of the situations, and this is what your LCPs are supposed to be doing right now. And the LCP is supposed to be out there enforcing labor law and not simply trying to figure out how to keep the project going. It's an unfortunate, but it's one of the many conflicts that a school district has to deal with in building a project. But if you have withholding if they're not turning in the certified payroll records, and that withholding is supposed to make sure that the person who's committing the violation is getting their payment stopped, and that's just like not turning in your invoice. No invoice, no payment. The other thing is if after they've done an investigation, that's a statutory requirement to have done an investigation, they find a violation, then they can order the school district to retain the money to remedy that violation, the back wages and penalties. And that's in the law now, and that's the same enforcement mechanism that the CMU will use. They're not going to stop payments because they suspect a violation. I've heard of some LCPs doing that. That's not a statutory authority the labor commissioner has, but once they investigate and find a violation, then they can, then they'll order the school district to retain the money.
notification now comes from the CMU.
If it's their project, yes. Yeah.
Okay, Lyle?
First, I want to make a comment about the calculation of the maximum fee, because it does create a potential for substantial inequity for large districts that are paying millions of dollars for land acquisition versus suburban smaller districts that are paying $100,000 or Rob that's paying $300,000 an acre for land. So I just want to make that statement that this potential for inequity may or may not come back to be revisited. But on the form, I'm looking at this form. I think it needs to be clarified that contract awarded prior to or after January 1st, 2012, exactly what that means, because just reading these regulations before I came here today, I would have interpreted that word to mean any contract that was issued after January 1st would be subject to blah, blah, blah. And what I heard, and I think I'm hearing, is that it's the main project contract determines the whole project. Is that a correct statement? So, in other words, if...
That's our interpretation, yes.
Pardon?
That's our interpretation, yes.
Well, I want to make sure it's OPSC's interpretation, too, because,
no control.
I mean, you could use, if I'm hearing this correctly, you could use the concept of what OPSC does in other ways, 50% of the contract or project under contract as of January 1st. It's not, if 50% is after, it is, and that's a pretty clean thing that I think most districts understand now. So I think that really needs to be clarified. And then my last piece of this is a question. On this says school facility program project, contract awarded on or after January 1st, 2012, subject to labor code additional grant. Now, is the grant going to be made for districts that are running their own LCP or PLAs? And if so, then the next question that follows along with part of this, maybe you already know the answer, is if the billing from DIR or the cost of running the program is less than the grant, is it just part of savings?
So, two questions. First question is a good question, and it's something that really, again, right now we don't have a final position on, whether districts that have their own in-house, whether they get the additional grant. So there isn't a formal position yet from OPSC. Second question, at this point, if we calculate the 1/4%, and if it's, again, after DIR does their monitoring, there's a remaining balance from what was calculated versus what was used, at this point, we are considering that that is just part of the district's savings that can be used for other capital outlays, same conditions as other, right?
Conditions, right.
Except for financial hardships.
Well,
Same rules apply.
Right. Savings on financial hardships follows different rules, so.
Questions or comments from members of the audience? Can you come up and use one of the mics over here, perhaps? Unless there's some, I don't think there's anything else.
I'm happy here. Thank you. Sorry, Fred. This question I wanted to get up because it was directed to DIR, first of all. Are you discontinuing approvals of LCPs for school districts so they can operate their own from this point forward?
No.
So you are, in fact, continuing to approve LCPs for districts that choose to operate their own LCPs?
Yeah, we have applications that are in the pipeline right now.
Okay, which then leads me to the question to OPSC. If you're going to only allow LCPs that pre-existed January 1, then you're completely ignoring the fact that the DIR folks are going to be approving LCPs in the future. I believe that the pre-existing rule interpretation should be pre-existing the project, not pre-existing the implementation of the regulations. So I'd like to ask you to consider that, because they are going to get projects, you are going to have districts that are in fact going to get an approved LCP and want to use their own LCP and their own internal staff to implement those programs.
Let me address a slight nuance.
Need to use a mic.
Let me address a slight nuance in the answer that you received on whether or not we've stopped approving LCPs, these in-house LCPs. And the answer you received was that we have not stopped that. One thing to keep in mind is that there are other programs outside of public school construction, these types of state bonds, where DIRs simply must continue to approve LCPs. So the real question for us is whether or not we will continue after today, after January 1, 2012, to continue to approve LCPs, which will be used by folks receiving state bond funds to be exempt from the DIR service. And DIR has not made a position on that yet.
Well, could we clarify this just a little bit more? I mean, maybe we need to, because the statute says that the exception is for the contract awarded on or after the effective date if the awarding body had previously initiated a labor compliance program approved by the department. So I guess you could interpret that to be previously to the law or previously to the project or contract. And so if that's an important point for school districts. So if DIR is going to, I think you could reasonably interpret the statute both either way, and so it gives districts more flexibility to be able to initiate in-house LCPs that are approved by DIR to comply. So I think we should follow up on that one and make sure. And it sounds like you are in the business of still approving LCPs.
Yeah.
And there's nothing in your regs that would stand in the way of that, correct? Of a district that came in after the statute goes into effect, but before a contract is signed, they go to you with their LCP, you approve it, and then now that meets the exception under this.
It's been an interpretation question. and we also, as Mark said, we have the other type of situation, including an awarding body that wants to have the traditional kind of labor compliance program like LAUSD has. We're going to do it on all of our projects. And I don't think there's going to be any change on that. In terms of this previously approved language is in the AB 4436. I would agree it can be interpreted either way. The problem that we're looking at, frankly, I think I alluded to it earlier, is that there are still a lot of the third parties that are trying to figure out a way to get in under this, to get the exemption, to get the stream of revenue provided by the bonds, or at least provided by the grant that comes from the State Allocation Board, and the statute doesn't leave any room for that third-party model.
I would agree.
Just does not.
I'm reading it right here.
What we do want and will work towards is a harmonized agreement with OPSC about what the previously approved qualifier is.
Okay, so that's, Richard, very good.
I have one more, and it's an observation. Having read the October 31 memoranda that went out that Lyle made reference, I think Lyle made reference to. Bob did. Sorry, Bob. Didn't mean to pass on your credits. But one of the last comments made was that as long as the district has entered into the contract, that's the basic general contract for construction. When I read that memorandum, if the district would be entering into 10 different contracts, and the first one is only site development, the demolition of buildings, let's say, and that's the only first contract, that's the trigger, even though it has nothing to do with the building, but it is the first step in the whole project, as the gentleman here had mentioned, the discrete project. It is the first step. So as long as we've entered into the first contract of the discrete project, then the entire project is either in or out on January 1. So I'm wondering, I want to be sure that the interpretation doesn't pose that since we haven't entered into the contract to build the buildings, that it deems to be not eligible by regulations in the OPSC regs.
And we'll have to work with DIR to get a better understanding so that we can have a joint position, but something we'll look into.
But, Richard, so I mean, if in that case, if this is on or after January 1st, you would presumably make the filing when the first public works contract is let of your demolition of your multi-phase project. You'd make your electronic submission, and you would initiate the compliance at that time, right?
I'm still trying to understand what's all happening here today. Okay, this is still very cloudy. I mean, I can see some of my clients that I work with asking me questions that I have absolutely no answer to, absolutely none. Okay, but the issue here is, which they have asked me in this magical date of January 1st. Am I having to deal with the CMU unit if I have awarded the contract prior to the first of the year, and it's only for one contract, a smaller contract, for the whole scope of the project? Can I then use a third-party provider, whether they were or were not grandfathered in under the September rules at DIR? These are the kinds of questions I'm being posed. Third-party providers submitted to DIR a laundry list of projects they agreed they would continue to monitor. And at that time, there was an understanding. Those grandfathered lists are still out there. And then there's some districts that didn't have their project listed, but they're going to start their project before the first of the year. How do they fit into this whole ball of wax? Thank you.
Other comments or questions from members of the audience? Hearing none. Thank you very much to DIR and to OPSC. So I'd like to, unless people think otherwise, I'd like to come back at 1:30, and perhaps we could develop, just go through and coordinate a list of follow-up questions, coordination questions that OPSC and DIR can work on. If that's okay with everyone, be back here at 1:30. Thanks.
Everybody.
Okay, welcome back, everyone, and hopefully we'll have a brief minute here. I want to go over a couple of things before we do a follow-up and review of the follow-up materials that questions that we want to take care of. One of them is, I think that you might have a copy of a memo that we got from Sina Salek, who's an attorney that worked on labor compliance program provisions. This is a confirming memo that gives you the legal structure of how project labor agreements are considered to be collective bargaining agreements, and it's just for your information, but it's basically background in federal law that sets up project labor agreements as a type of pre-hire collective bargaining agreement that's unique to the construction industry, so it's really just for your information and consideration. But I think it's also important if districts do enter into project labor agreements, there is an additional piece of legislation that was passed this year, SB 922, that does set out new standards for project labor agreements, and if districts have agreements in place, they may want to check the language of the agreements. For example, there's new standards for public entity PLAs that include non-discrimination and access to work clauses, drug testing protocols, guarantees against work stoppages, and dispute resolution provisions, which are now contained in the new in this new bill. And so I think it's important if districts have PLAs that they may want to go back and look at the language and just confirm that they meet those requirements. Do you want to say, you have a comment on that, Cesar?
Absolutely. I think you summarized it quite well. The project labor agreements that are out there now contain all of this language already. This was now provided in a statute, so you may just want to go back and, as you're looking forward to enter into new agreements, that they have these taxpayer provisions included in there.
Good, thank you. So the other thing, yes, sir.
I just want to ask a question. This is a pretty good-looking document to me. I went over it at lunchtime, and it looked like a pretty reasonable document. And I was just wondering, does DIR have to sign off on a PLA saying it's satisfying the requirements of the law, and have they read this? If they would review it and say, yeah, this looks good, I think it would go a long ways towards really nailing down what districts need to do.
I don't think they necessarily have to sign off on whether it's complies with the law, but technically speaking, if they're going to receive the contract, they actually know that the contractors are bound, the signatures are there by the unions, also by the board members as well as the contractor. So that in and of itself will fulfill DIR's role. Now, of course, the PLA has to comply with new law beginning on January 1st. So, but yes, there is a way to do it.
But and just to follow up on that, if you go back to the DIR form, if you check the box that says you have a PLA, right below there in fine print it says send us a copy. So we assume that means that DIR will be following up and reviewing and confirming that your PLA meets their standards. So maybe that's a question that we should take as a follow-up item to them. Does that seem like a good idea? So if there's not any other questions right now, I know, one more thing. Can we set the date for our follow-up meeting? What's the pleasure of the committee? Thursday the 1st or Friday the 2nd?
Can't make Thursday.
All right, then we'll decide. Okay. Which way?
Can't make Thursday or Friday.
Okay. Well, then
I could send
you can send somebody. We've got Friday as our proposed date for all of our future meetings, and hopefully that'll be okay. So it sounds like it was pretty mixed on the committee here. So I'm going to just say Friday the 2nd. Okay? Sorry if that's, but I think it'll work for some, and that'll be our follow-up meeting to hopefully finalize what we want to take to the board on December 14th so that we can be in compliance by the start of the implementation timeframe for AB 436. Okay. 9:30, yes. Well, we'll get a notice out. So what I'd like to accomplish at this point is that we come up with a list of follow-up questions and coordination questions between DIR and OPSC, and then straight-up follow-up questions to OPSC, and obviously any straight-up follow-up questions to DIR. So, Jeremy, we've asked you to be the keeper of the official list, and so can you go ahead? And so the first one is from Mr. Smoot was DIR sign-off on PLAs. What are they looking at? What's the requirement? Sort of how does that go, that process, okay? So that's one. So I think we can open it up to anyone on the committee or in the audience in terms of, maybe we should also try and summarize the questions and the areas that we had concerns in the first round of questioning, and so going back to the stuff that you asked before that we didn't have total closure on, let's get those out so we have a list of things that we can come back with. Lee?
Thanks, Bill. I think my question or comment falls into that category. It's more of, the more we talked about it, the more I was confused about a district that has multiple projects, both state-funded and non-state funded, and if there could be some different scenarios on that. You know, you decide to do state funding later, you don't. You know, some different scenarios that says what you would do, what you need, what you have to do.
Okay. Mary?
Yeah, along those same lines, we were talking about what is the definition of all projects. And if you don't do the first project that comes down the pike, does that mean you can't do any of the others if all is required? What happens?
Okay. Kathy?
We two were also discussing this at lunch, ironically. So, same thing. So let's just say I'm a district that has a little bit of bond money left, and I don't have eligibility right now. And February 1, I sign a project contract to do something, and I spend the rest of my capital improvement funds. And I'm lucky in November of 2012 when I pass a bond. And so I go ahead and I update my eligibility. So let's just say come 2013, I now have eligibility and I now have money. Is this a yearly snapshot? So in other words, from January 1 of 2012 to December 31st of 2012, was that one time frame? Or is it just when I do the P, whatever it's called, thing, 100 thing, sorry, whatever. Because I'm now eligible, but I'm certainly after January 2012. What does that do to me? In other words, am I out of the game because
you did a project?
I did a project with it, because I have tons of projects that do not qualify for state funding. But I also have projects that qualify for state funding, and some of these are putsy little projects. I think it would be fiscally foolish of me to go sign up with DIR for the CMU on my little putsy projects. So, but at the same time, you know, if that's going to jeopardize my funding on the projects that I am eligible for state monies on, then I may take another look at that. So there might be two questions in there. Is it a year at a time kind of thing, or is it a come January 1, 2012, if I ever want to get state funding again, I got to check the box on every single project I submit?
Okay, so how would we characterize, what's the broader question here? Do you have something, way you can clarify that, Dennis?
Well, I think that the broader question is on his comment, and I forget the gentleman's name, the head of that group, but his comment that if we ever want to possibly get funding on a project, that we should have all of your projects under this process. I question that, and I think that goes to what you're part of what you're saying, Kathy, is that necessary, and is there a process by which, project by project, or is there a process by which, you know, when we start a project that doesn't go with their process, and then we decide to get into state funding, can we transition that project into this process?
Okay. Yeah, say that.
And thanks for clarifying that as well. I think also the concern from the building trades perspective is that there will be times in considering your situation that a project moves along, is completed, then they move to receive state funding afterwards, and then there has been no compliance of prevailing wage enforcement performed on that. So we have to work around how to get to that so that their districts are properly notified and they're not penalized for anything that can take place there. So definitely acknowledge that. But we also want to make sure that it doesn't happen afterwards, that it just doesn't become something that you pay for, because you need to have an actual person go into the job site and ensure that the proper work people are working on different sets. So you don't have an electrician that's performing laborer's work or a laborer's work that's performing electrical work, because that's a violation of prevailing wage there as well. So that's what I'd like to say. But I also would like to add on something and for clarification from DIR and OPSC, that is, if they're going to waive a fee for a district that has an in-house labor compliance program, in the statute it says that that labor compliance program must cover all the public works projects of that particular district, not just the ones that are coming for state funds. So I just want to make sure that that's something that they can come back with clarification, I think, for the districts.
Okay. Lee?
And off of Cesar, your comment, I am truly mystified now, because I thought that the all or nothing, when I was reading this, that it referred to if that limit on prevailing wage. That was the all or nothing. There was a limit on prevailing wage that started to talk about all. And then somehow it morphed into all of your projects better be CMU or something like that. So I echo your need for clarification on that. I'm just truly confused now. And some kind of matrix or something with scenarios I think would help districts. And I have one more. Back to the billing question. I'm really concerned about transparency on the billing, and DIR folks said that they would do that. I would like to know who's defining overhead. They said reasonable overhead is also going to be billed, and I'd like to know how that's defined and who's going to keep track of that.
I have a follow-up question, please, if I could.
Sure.
Also, who's keeping track of what the cap, the OPSC cap is? Is that something that DIR is going to get the information on what the maximum fee is and they're going to stop billing at that point, or is that something that the district has to keep track of, that there's a possibility that they'll overbill and the district just stops paying at that point, or, who keeps track of that?
Isn't it from the form?
That would be on the actual funding shell that we take to the board, so that would be made available. So you're saying after that's made available, who's going to make sure that you don't go above it?
It's readily available information to the district and possibly to DIR. I don't know if DIR gets that form or not, but who is actually in charge of saying, we stop billing at this point?
Well, and you're going to submit information regarding the total state funds that they have that information on their form, right? Yeah, it's on there.
State funds, but not the cap. I mean, they could.
Well, they can calculate.
They can calculate it, but yeah.
The cap is going to be on the form. I'm sorry if I missed it. It's going to be on our funding application.
On your form.
Yes.
Not the application form.
Got it.
Okay. Fred?
My taxes just went up. From what I read of the DIR, there's a nexus between the fee and the service. Now, if what the state gives is much greater than the service provided, it is regarded as savings. Is nexus now no longer existing? Well, there could be in some because we're counting land acquisition, DTSC, in that. Okay.
Well, why don't you, the doubters aside, why don't you...
Well, and then the auditors in 5 years will say, hey, there's a problem.
And so frame this as a question and a follow-up
Okay,
for
Alex.
What
Is there a concern of the nexus being questioned if the apportioned amount is greater than the fee or than the service provided for 100?
Okay, all right. Go ahead.
In an effort simply to kind of shrink down the all question, maybe consensus for the group to understand what that question means. For me, they sent a letter out to all districts, and they also said it here today that CMU projects starting January 1, 2012, if they're applying for state bond funds, you must go through CMU. If there's another legal trigger that requires the CMU, like design build, even if it's not state funded, that was number 2. And then number 3 said, or the awarding body chooses to have all of its projects go under the CMU. And what we were, that's what caused fires, because the question was, if we're not sure it's going to be eligible for state funding when we award, but we think there's a good chance, we'd like to just do it, some of us. But in writing, and what they said at the start of the meeting was, you can't just pick one. It's all or none, or state-funded projects. So if a project, just to be safe, we check the box and say, yeah, we want CMU to be implemented here, but it doesn't get state funding. Are we somehow in violation, or does that now trigger that all of our projects, even if it's a $15,000 roofing job, has to go through CMU? They said yes to that and then said no later on in the meeting. But in writing, in the regs, I think that it says you have to. So that's where I'm.
Okay. So, yes, sir.
I want to get an answer to the question of, is funding provided even if you're operating under an exemption? In other words, your local LCP program. And of course, along with that is that question of what is previous LCP, whether that can be a previous to the project or previous to the law, implementation of regulations.
Yeah, that's it. That's an important one. Thank you. Are there any members of the audience who have follow-up questions or items that they want to get further clarification on that we can bring back for our next meeting? And we already, Jeremy, you already have Mr. Gonzalez's question from before, so we'll consider that as one of our follow-up questions. Kathy?
Since this is applying to all projects that receive state bond funds, one would have to assume Caltrans is also part of this, and State Water Resources Control Board, all those other agencies. Is there a way to find out if we're being fairly consistent across the board? I mean, maybe they've developed some regs already that could be utilized by us so that we're not recreating the wheel, or are they maybe perhaps raising the same concerns?
Try to answer
that. Yeah. Okay.
I think that the State Allocation Board, OPSC, and DIR made basically with this proposal, they've invested a lot of work, and I think this is actually better than other agencies would actually have to do, because those agencies will actually be charged the fee. Here you're receiving a share of it, yeah. So I think this is kind of better off than what other public works projects. Now, when you mentioned Caltrans has an internal labor compliance program already, so they may have that fee waived, but they operated that without any reimbursement from the state as well.
So I'm just, things along the line of change orders. You know, we've talked about total project apportionment, multi-year projects. I check a box, I type in $1 million, and I have, 50,000 in change orders, and I know it's chump change, but it almost sounds like whatever I write down as my initial estimated project cost is what not triggers, how the fee is going to be calculated. I could change that project substantially down the road. So I'm just wondering if and not that I'm advocating for DIR to pick up more fees, but
it sounds like a great idea.
So what I think is...
Well, this is the 100% local funded person here who might be stupid enough to sign up and do CMUs on every one of her projects. it's a concern. So
Well, I think the big question is, how does the notion that DIR has in their regs and on their form for total project costs, how does that relate to the 1/4% of total bond proceeds that is in the statute, that is the maximum cap that we can pay? Because those two numbers are potentially completely different. And I think we've had discussions internally with them where, and said, these numbers are not going to match at all. And in many cases, project costs are going to be much higher than the state bond proceeds amounts. And they said, we know that, and we're prepared to do the work.
Where did you find their definition of total project cost? You mentioned that it doesn't include fees and stuff.
It's in their regulations. There's a section to calculate it. On page 13 of their Reg 16452C, the gross amount of every contract for public works within the meaning of Section 1720. So it has to be a public works project to be covered under total project cost and not a soft cost. So again, if you use the lens of prevailing wage, if it's subject to prevailing wage, it would be calculated as a project as under that. If it's not, then it wouldn't.
I'm thinking on soft costs, I believe we have surveyors that are prevailing wage. Do we have any other consultants?
Testing laboratories.
Testing labs? Anybody that comes out to the site, right, is prevailing wage.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to think of if there were anything else on a typical project that would be covered. I mean, that would be subject to prevailing wage. I couldn't think of anything else. Those types of consultants would
That would
be
only
part.
come into play if you're doing this independent of bond.
Correct.
That's correct. That's my understanding. But that's part of what we want to clarify, Jeremy, with them, is when does total project costs kick in? Is that when you're voluntarily using it, signing up for the CMU on a non-funded project, and how does that relate to the state bond proceeds that we calculate the fee on? Okay. Yes, sir.
Are we all really nailed down and on the same page as to what constitutes a project that is subject to the new program versus the old program? In other words, that issue of when is a project contract issued? Richard had an example, site development contract is issued. Does that now mean that contract, that project, and all the contracts that will come after it are not subject to the new rules, they're subject to the old rules? And that's what I heard DIR say, and I just want to make sure that everybody's in agreement with that, and it's clearly stated someplace in here that that's, because in my reading, I'll go back and read it all again, of course, for the next meeting, but like I say, when I first read this, I thought it meant any contract you issued after January 1st is subject to the new program, and anything that wasn't, which creates all kinds of other questions in and of itself. I like the idea that there's a nailed down point before it, you're subject to the old, after it, you're subject to the new. Whatever that is, I really would just like to see it nailed down very well.
And I totally agree.
Yeah, they talked about the fact that if it's a multi-prime, that the main contract, well, that needs a lot of definition, because what is the main contract?
So let me just get to understand this a little bit better. So you're saying if you meet a certain threshold before 2012, then you're not subject to the next, basically the CMU or the next rules of the law. But that threshold is sort of in question, right, whether under existing law versus what's going to buy it in 2012. Okay.
But Caesar, it was more along the lines of, if I've already started the project, then and I have other contracts associated with that project, maybe the framing or the roofing or something. He did say, if you've already started the project and it's just part of the project, even if it's after January 1, 2012.
Yeah, it sounds like that.
Then those pieces that come after January wouldn't. But I don't know that that's in the law, and I don't know that OPSC would agree with that.
And I'm not sure how it plays into how we're going to administer it in terms of when the project is apportioned and the funds are released at that time.
Right.
Anyway,
That's why I think it's really important to nail that down.
okay, I hear you. Can we take a comment from Mr. Gonzalez?
Again, I want to reference their October 31 memorandum that specifically spoke to this point. They talked about it in terms of uniqueness of the project. It is a unique, discrete, definable project, which is, as an example, you buy the land and build a 10-classroom new school on the property. If that's the scope of the project, and you've entered into one contract prior to December 31st or January 1, then that project is subject to the old rules and do not fall under 436. No, I'm making a statement. that it's, their October 31 memorandum speaks to that point.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Lee.
I think with Richard, what's the question to my mind would be then, are the subsequent project contracts subject? Because that's what you're talking about. Because you might have a demo project, you might have interim classrooms that go in. That's a public works project, folks. I mean, isn't it?
Sure.
So there's a definite. It goes by definition of public works project, and that I think that's pretty clear what a public works project is. So to my mind, that's the contract. That I'm hoping it's not that, but that, to me, that seems like that would be triggering it.
Certainly, because you're not just demoing for the sake of demoing, you're actually going to build something on there, so you're tying it all together.
Aren't the workers there subject to prevailing wage?
Absolutely, demolition is subject to prevailing wage. Yeah.
So, I don't know.
Well, it would have to be a part of the project. In other words, if we submitted a project to OPSC and SAB, and it included demo, and you issued a contract for that, well, then it would probably be included. If that, sometimes you don't include the demo in the project that you're filing with OPSC for various reasons, that means that would be a separate public works project at that point, and not, you know, and it would follow its own rules, you know, not necessarily tied to the same project.
I'm not sure that I would go by that rule, because there may be cases where for an overall project like demolition that it just may not be worth submitting that portion of it to OPSC because it doesn't have any impact on the project, but it's still a part of the project.
Well, I agree with what you're saying, Dennis, but you've got to have some way to nail it down and say, what was the project? You know, and if it's not in the plans, I don't know how you can point to it and say, we thought that was part of that project and subject to then the rules applicable to that project, when it's quite potentially a totally separate public works project. And I think it's important to nail those things down, whatever the rule is. I mean, I'm not even sure we care, but whatever the rule is, we'd like to know.
Okay. Juan, do you have some follow-ups you want to do?
I think we're going to have to reevaluate the date of the next meeting. All these questions.
We just set the date. I think it's great. Oh, I see. So I think obviously at OPSC we're going to need to look at the process. We have a group of projects that are going to be provided with actual apportionments in December, on the 14th of December. Many of those projects will potentially be subject to AB 436 regulations, because many of them won't have contracts until after the 1st. And will then be I think, the next time.
I can answer it now.
Okay, good. We'll take it off the list.
Yes, for those projects, right now, we're looking at all the projects that that may receive potentially an apportionment on December. From that list, there could be projects that when they submitted their funding application, they didn't indicate that they have entered into a contract yet. So we can assume that they haven't, and they may after the first of the year. And for those projects, we do plan on bringing back an item to give them an additional amount for the CMU fee. So we're going to keep them open, so to speak. There's going to be an apportionment, but we recognize that they may be under the new rules if they award a contract after the beginning of next year. So we are planning on giving those projects an additional amount, the 1/4% for those fees. Does that?
That's very helpful. I think that's good. I'm glad you got it out there. Thank you. Okay. Yes, sir.
Sorry,
You're reaching your limit. No, just kidding. Go ahead.
Half? Following along with that, and I'm sure you can't come up with an answer to this one, when the project, when the project is adjusted at the end of the line, like a lot of our projects are for additional site costs and potentially DTSC fees, et cetera, I'm assuming there'll be a supplement included with that for those that are subject to it. I think my question really is more along the lines of, and like I say, I assume that it is a true statement that you'll automatically add the funding for this if it's eligible and required. But my question is, in this overall billing, potentially DIR would have completed their billing cycle based on the original funding amount, not including the additional funding that would be provided, and I'm kind of wondering how that process might work.
Yeah, it's something we haven't really considered. Be really interested to have a separate conversation in terms of what those, there's only certain things that could get adjusted, right, from the apportionment. We're talking about things after the full and final, such as site. And out of those things, which of them would be subject to CMU monitoring, I don't know. That's something we need to take a look at. We haven't really considered it, and whether there needs to be an adjustment after that fact. So we'll take a look at it.
Yeah, I don't, that's all right. Let's figure that out and work on it as we go along.
Cesar?
Just interested also, in addition to clarifying all the questions for school districts as they're moving to AB 436 implementation, to basically put out information about the waivers, the waiver opportunity, whether you have your in-house labor compliance program, what that should look like, and the project labor agreement also option included in that.
Okay. All right. So we have a list of questions. Jeremy is our official scribe, and we'll get something out to you. And just on that, we anticipate that we'll be meeting with DIR next week, or maybe not next week, the following week at the latest. So at least to have one more internal coordination meeting with them, and we will see you back here on December 2nd when everything will become clear.
Hey, Bill, good job.
Yeah.
Can we get the list of questions ourselves too pretty quickly, as soon as LPSC and DIR get them as well?
That's what I kept telling him.
Okay, yeah, good. Because that way we can kind of chew on it.
Yeah. Yeah, harder. All right. Good job. Thanks. Thanks, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll wait up.
I wasn't looking for that. That was a curveball. You did a perfect.